Notre Dame fans, welcome to another edition of Irish Breakdown Podcast. We missed you all yesterday, so we're back today with two shows. The first show is going to be about the Notre Dame wide receivers and tight ends heading into spring ball. Tonight, Ryan, we're going to watch some film. And if that dude looks familiar but doesn't look like you were expecting to see, obviously that's not Vince. That is Ryan Roberts, our director of recruiting at Irish Breakdown. Vince D'Addario got booted out of his dungeon. He's on a work release program from his cell at his high school. And so he couldn't, just kind of being funny, but basically where he was today, his connection wasn't good, and so we just couldn't get it going. So Vince is producing today, and you guys are stuck with me and Ryan. So Vince will hopefully be back tomorrow. I think he said he should be back and good to go tomorrow. So we'll have plenty to talk about tomorrow. So Ryan's going to join us today to talk receivers and tight ends. And Ryan, I think the thing for me, there's a lot of new at Notre Dame right now. I mean, when it comes to this position group, you've got, two new position coaches in Jared Parker at tight ends and Chancey Stuckey at wide receivers. You've lost, you're going to have to replace your leading pass catcher at wide receiver for, I believe this is going to be the fifth straight season, right? So 18, 19, 20, 21, and now 22. They've lost their top pass catcher at wide receiver from the previous season. So there's part is going to be new, obviously, and you lost George Takis, who was your number 2 tight end. So there's a lot of uncertainty at the receiver position, but also, Ryan, I think a lot of talent, and I think that's the very interesting thing about this group. And we decided to do receivers and tight ends together because whenever we have the conversation last year about who's the alpha going to be a receiver, we're always like, it's Michael Mayer. You know what I mean? Hey, makes sense to kind of bring these guys together, especially with how we think the tight ends are going to be used this season, that it's going to even be more so the receivers and tight ends are going to have to be on the same page a lot. So we decided to do them together. But I think the way that I would describe it, Ryan, is the receiver/tight end room has a lot of talent and tons of potential, but also has arguably the smallest margin for error on the offense, if not the entire team, in regards to, because of some issues that have happened in the past and some injuries, and injuries being more so at tight end than receiver, because tight end has a lot of numbers. There's just some injuries that because of the receiver, issues that they're in a position where they can't afford to have a combination of things go wrong, whether it be a couple of injuries, whether it be an injury and someone not panning out, whether it be whatever the case may be. The margin for error for this to be a really good group, and a group that has some ability but is not good enough to really be like that championship caliber group, is really thin. And that's going to be the biggest thing. And this spring is going to tell us a lot about, are we going to see the production this year, or are we still going to be talking about potential when we're having this conversation a year from now?
Yeah, I find it really interesting, too, because I want to see what the offense is going to look like, because we saw in Oklahoma State specifically, schematically, traditionally over the last few years, that boundary wide receiver has kind of been the big mainstay as far as a true wide receiver position. But we saw a lot more RPO action in that system. You're seeing the slots get involved a lot more. Lorenzo Styles had a bunch of big plays off the RPO action. So I find it interesting, Brian. I really want to see, especially with what Tyler Buckner brings to the quarterback position potentially. I feel like we might see a little bit of a shift in ideology as far as how this offense is going to run. And obviously, that boundary position still with guys like Dion Colzi is going to be paramount for the offense. But seeing if, hey, are we going to get more just quick hitters, arrow routes off of the RPO action? Are we going to get some more screens? If are we going to see kind of a shift in how this offense is formatted? That's really what I want to see. And then, like you said, we know who Michael Mayer is, but without a guy like a George Takis as part of those 2 tight end sets potentially, Kane Barong was a guy people are excited about. Obviously, he's going to be working back from an injury going into the fall. We have guys like Mitchell Evans, who played a decent amount as a freshman, but is unproven as the second guy. We have guys, that we're excited about, but there are some question marks. But I really just want to see, structurally speaking, how does this offense look under Tommy Rees from a wide receiver perspective? And I think that we will see not the full scope of it in the spring, but I think we'll start to see a little bit of that implementation in the spring.
What we see remains to be known. I mean, we're only going to get 5 practices, 1 full practice. That's it. We're not going to get a chance to see a lot. I will say this: I think what happens this spring is going to go a long way towards determining what Tyree thinks he can do with his offense.
Sure.
And look, we'll get into a lot of things. Whether or not the injured players come back healthy. That includes tight ends and receivers. Is Avery Davis going to be 100% back to full speed, or is he going to be at 90? 90% of Avery Davis isn't as a guy that you're going to be as comfortable with going out and making plays against Ohio State and Clemson and teams like that, which we know Avery can do because he's already proven that, right? At 100%, he's proven that. You talk about tight end position, obviously with Kane Barong coming back from an injury. Eli Raridan has an injury in December that, that raises doubts about when he's going to be back to full speed and healthy. And then, of course, Mitchell Evans being that guy that has a lot of potential, and the staff. I mean, people at Notre Dame, we haven't seen it because we've seen barely any practices since he's arrived. He was just used as kind of a blocker when he got in at times last year. But I've talked to people at Notre Dame, and it's not just one person, that they say this kid has day 2 NFL draft potential. I said, oh, that's okay. That's interesting. Like, let's see that. Now, again, I'm not disputing that because we haven't seen the kid. Mm-hmm. He's already proven to be better than I thought he was going to be, which I love. You know what I mean? Like, it's like this kid was a quarterback as a senior. I didn't know what to expect from the kid.
Yeah.
But what's he going to be? Is he going to be ready? Because he was kind of put into a position last year where he didn't necessarily earn playing time as much as he had to play because of the injuries at tight end, because Kevin Bauman was hurt. And, when they needed to go to a third tight end, it was like, who are you going to put in? It's 2 freshmen, right? And it's not a shot at Mitchell Evans. It's just that, like, it was just a different situation that got him onto the field. So, does Braden Lindsey kind of do what he needs to do? I mean, there's just so many questions around there to determine, do you have 3 receivers? Do you have 5, 6 receivers where you can say, hey, we're going to run a lot of 11 personnel? Or do you say, hey, look, we don't necessarily have as much faith in our number 2 and number 3 tight end as we've had the last couple of years. So, we can't do as much 12 personnel. A lot of that's going to be determined by, I think, a lot of it is going to be determined by what we see this spring, because there's not a ton of reinforcements coming at wide receiver. You're going to have Avery Davis and Tobias Merriweather added, right? Those are 2 really good football players, but it's like, it doesn't necessarily, if like all your other guys aren't playing or hurt, it doesn't necessarily move the needle. Tight end should be interesting when some guys come back. But receiver, I think you need to get some questions answered this spring. I think that's a big thing. And I think some of these tight ends that are getting an opportunity because of other injuries, some of these receivers who are going to get playing time because of the lack of depth at the position, it's either going to be a huge bonus or it's going to expose them as just not quite ready yet. And I think those are the big questions that I have about this group coming into the spring. And, Ryan, there's kind of 3 objectives if you're the Notre Dame coaching staff. The Notre Dame coaching staff is going to have 3 objectives coming into the spring. And in my opinion, this is just as this offensive unit when it comes to the receivers and tight ends. Number 1, we need to see improved technique at wide receiver, right? We've talked a lot about it. It's needed. You have to have it. It's so important. If you're going to beat the best teams in the schedule, you can't just go out talent people to 10, 11 wins this year like you have in the past. There's going to be enough teams on the schedule that can beat you this year that weren't on the schedule last year or the year before, really. I mean, there was one team the last 2 years that honestly was on Notre Dame's level from a talent standpoint, and that was Clemson 2 years ago, right? Cincinnati was not, with all due respect. They had a couple guys that were there, but as a team, they should not have done to Notre Dame what they did. It's, can your receivers play with the same level of technique that we see at Ohio State, that we see at Alabama, that we see at some of those other top programs? Number 2 is a second tight end has to emerge. And yes, they will get reinforcements this summer when Kane Barong finally gets back to being healthy. Holden Stace will show up this summer. Eli Raridan, we expect to be back sometime early in the fall because he was injured in November. So, it's usually like a 6 to 8 month thing with a knee. Sometimes it can take 8 to 9 months, but that gets him right into September. So we should see him at some point in time this season. But again, true freshman coming off a knee injury. If they don't feel like they at least have a second tight end coming out of the spring between the 2 guys in the competition, that's going to be problematic and concerning for them. And then the third piece is we know there's one certainty at this skill group, Ryan, and that's Michael Mayer. And we'll talk about him in a second. But somebody has to step up and be his complement. Kevin Austin was that at times last year. They need someone that can kind of step up and say, hey, look, you can't just worry about taking Michael Mayer out of the game. Right, you're going to have to worry about me because I'm going to tell you something right now. Ohio State, their game plan in the opener is going to be 87's not beating us because nobody else on that offense is proven. 87 is a dude. We're going to make sure he doesn't beat us. So right away, this group and the running back group is going to get put to the test and say, Ohio State's going to dare you to beat them. They're going to dare you to beat them. Go make them pay for it, because they're not going to let 87 beat them. And if they do let 87 beat them, then they're coached even worse than they've been in the last few years, which is not a good sign, because they have not been coached well on defense since Jeff Hafley left. So somebody's going to have to step up, and ideally more somebodies. And that's the other thing, is like, you want more somebodies to kind of step up, but you need at least one guy, I think, to step up and say, hey, look, teams have to game plan for that guy every game. I think there's a lot of candidates, Ryan, but somebody has to do it. So those are sort of the three objectives that we have, that Notre Dame has coming into, hopefully, that they need to meet during the spring, coming out of the spring, heading into the summer.
Yeah, I think it's paramount for two different ways as far as the Michael Mayer usage, right? Like you said, early on, they're going to be like, that's the guy you have to stop. All-American tight end, future first round pick, 6'5", 250 plus. Like, you have to stop that dude. But then after that, not only do you need someone to take the pressure off of him, if you're able to get that much pressure onto yourself now, where like you might be the guy, like if Lorenzo Styles is now on his course to, like, let's say 1,000-yard receiving season, then all of a sudden Michael Mayer is the guy that's getting one-on-one situations. Right. Like, you have to force teams into bad situations, right? And I'm really interested to see Mitchell Evans, like you said. Just I don't know why, when you were describing that, they were higher on him, day 2 type of player, I just started thinking, like, is this like a Troy Nicholas thing about to happen right now, man? Is he about to take like that extension to being a player where you're just kind of like, a nice player, more of an athlete type, but then he takes a step forward to that type of level, which would be interesting. But the wide receiver unit, man, I said, a lot of very talented football players. Lorenzo Styles, everybody knows how big of a fan I am of him. Braden Lindsey could do some stuff after the catch that I think is going to be explosive, and I think you can use him in a lot of different ways. Expecting a big breakout for Dion Colzi. I think if it's the ideal situation, Brian, like you said, you leave spring, and like you said, you don't need. Well, let me rephrase. If you're getting Avery Davis back in the fall, right? In theory, you're going to get Tobias Merriweather to come in. If your unit, though, in the spring takes the next step going into the summer, and they are some dudes in there that you can depend on, then, hey, getting Avery Davis back and getting Tobias Merriweather, that becomes icing on the cake rather than a necessity. Like, I don't want those guys to be necessities. I want them to be, wow, now we get to add in even more talent. That's, for me, what needs to be the next step at wide receiver, especially with a first-year starting quarterback, because there's going to be some moments where he's going to make some bad decisions. He's going to put the ball in some bad spots, but you need the wide receivers to be able to be those playmakers where you take some of the pressure off of a young quarterback. You need that step, in my opinion.
Yeah, we could talk about like how the running backs can help and things like that. But at the end of the day, the running backs can only do so much in the pass game to take pressure. I mean, you use them more of a, if you're going to do this, we're going to hurt you because we're going to run this screen because you're double teaming him. And you only have so many of those bullets that you can use against a top team, against an Ohio State, against a Clemson, against an Oklahoma, Georgia, and Alabama, teams like that, right? It has to be perimeter players. And it doesn't have to be. The one thing I want to be clear to me, it doesn't have to be a guy that's like, a Will Fuller, a 70 catch, 1,000-yard guy. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. It can be multiple guys that can do damage. And the reason I say that is because in that case, it can be maybe a different guy each week. The way that this team is defending us is going to set up a big week for Lorenzo Styles or Braden Lindsey or Dion Colzi or Avery Davis. And then how the next week, how a team is defending you, it allows you to get some matchups with another player. But the more guys you have that can create problems, look, if they're going to focus their coverages, because let's be honest, there's nobody in the country that I'm aware of that I look at and say that guy can go get put on Michael Mayer one-on-one and just take him out of the game. I don't think that guy exists if Michael Mayer's playing his game, right? So you're going to have to put some sort of effort into having a plan for him. And when you're going to do that, so at least one guy is going to kind of have a favorable one-on-one type of matchup, right? And even in zone, you're going to have that, because if they're bracketing him with multiple players, then, if there's let's say he's running like an out cut and they're kind of playing him, the corners kind of playing like anytime Mayer breaks out, you jump that out cut. And then there's a linebacker kind of taking him. Well, whoever's running that vertical route's in a one-on-one with that deep quarter safety or that deep half safety or that, the middle free safety, whatever the case may be. So there's still going to be one-on-ones. Who can step up and exploit those one-on-one opportunities? And for me, I think you need to have more of those guys emerge. However, Ryan, a big key to this is Michael Mayer has to continue to grow his game. And it's not so much his development for me is I think there's room for him to refine himself as a route runner, which I think you expect from a kid who's only a sophomore. He may look like a grown freaking man that looks like a third-year NFL player, but he was just a true sophomore in college last year, right? Like his game isn't going to be a finished product, especially for a kid like Michael Mayer, because a lot of people forget Michael Mayer was a 3-time first-team All-State defensive player in high school. So he wasn't just playing tight end. He wasn't just going on camp circuits playing tight end. He was a linebacker, and he played D-end in his last year. And so he's still developing his game. He's advanced for his age, but when you project to be like that guy, there's still room for him to continue improving. It's not a ton. There's room for him to improve as a blocker. It's just about with any young player that achieves success, you've got to still be hungry for the next level. And that, because some players look, and I'm not saying this specifically about Michael Mayer, this is just a concern you have for any young player that has a lot of success early is he kind of have that I've arrived moment, or is it like, yeah, that was good, but I want more? I remember interviewing Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah the summer between his 2020 and 2021 seasons. And I'm having this interview with him, and it was a Zoom interview that we weren't using it was just, that was the only way we could communicate. And I'm sitting there, Liz talking, and I'm like trying to praise him and like, hey, you did a great job of this. And he would never answer my questions because he would always turn it back to, yeah, but I don't really see it that way. Like, I don't think I played that well. Here's the mistake I made. Yeah, okay, yeah, I had a lot of tackles against Iowa State, but here's 3 or 4 things that, could have hurt us, that I didn't do right. And you're just like, and it wasn't fake, Ryan. It was like, it was genuine, like, no, that's not good enough. And then you come out in the next year and he's an even better player than he was the year before because he was hungry to be great, to be the best. I think Michael Mayer has that same attitude, but we need to see it because there's still some parts of his game need to improve. The other part is not just him improving, but I want to see how the staff is going to use him more because I think that's something too, because the more you can move him around effectively and have packages for him as an attached tight end to the field, as an attached tight end to the boundary, as a wing tight end, as a movement tight end, as a flex tight end, as a slot tight end, as an outside guy. Those are all different ways you can line him up, but lining him up there doesn't necessarily impact defenses as much as lining him up there, then having effective stuff to utilize in the pass game out of those formations, right? That's going to be the key. So I think that's another piece to this spring is how does his game grow? Plus, how does his usage develop from a coaching standpoint? That's going to be another really interesting piece of this because he's got to be that guy to then take some of that. You have to be the alpha pressure off the other guys, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a dictating of matchups, right? Because I always think of like how the LA Rams, for instance, and obviously not every team has a Jalen Ramsey. So like this is not to say that every team you're going against is going to have just this stud defensive back that can work inside and out, do all types of things. But Jalen Ramsey will literally, Travis Kelce's the object this week, right? Like you have to stop Travis Kelce. This week it's Devontae Adams. You have to shadow him. And obviously it's not always going to happen like that. But either way, whether you have that ability to shadow a player or not, it's the ability to create matchups, right? Mm-hmm. And when you are a defense that can when you're an offense, that can dictate matchups, when you can create those matchups yourself, that's where you're so much more successful. Because, I mean, you could literally have your best defender follow Michael Mayer if that's the only player you have to worry about. If you're doing a bracket coverage, if you're doing this, you can roll things no matter where he's lined up to your points. But if you have a Lorenzo Styles take a big step and Avery Davis come back and take a next step, if you have a guy like a Dion Colzi take the next step, then that gives the ability to dictate those matchups and you can create your own matchups. And I think that's the biggest thing for me is that you need options because it can't just be as cut as dry as Michael Mayer is the best player, and then there's a huge drop-off to 2 and 3 are. You need multiple playmakers, and you need to have them all over the place or else you're going to become that's how you become one-dimensional. That's how you become predictive. Even if you're a team that has the ability to take Michael Mayer and put him in different spots. That doesn't mean that you aren't still predictable, because you still know where the ball is going. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're like this big creative offense and, oh man, everything's moving around. You still know who the number one option is, no matter where you're lining up. If you have guys that can do multiple things and take that pressure off, that's where the creativity comes from Tyree.
Because there's two things you do with moving Michael May around achieves two objectives. Your play calls are going to achieve two objectives. Number one, you're going to look at it and say, okay, how are we going to try to find ways to get him the ball? You got to find ways to get him the ball, no matter what they're doing. And then number two, you have to say, okay, if they're going to do this, how can we use him to manipulate the coverage to open somebody else up? Those are going to be the keys. Thoughts on that, Ryan? I got to go shut up my dogs. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Yeah, I think, again, that the biggest thing for when you're trying to create those matchups for Michael Mayer specifically, like Brian was just trying to indicate, is that you're trying to, first and foremost, create the ability to find Michael Mayer in a variety of ways. You are trying to make him the number one option. You're trying to find creative ways to get him open. But in order to find creative ways to get him open, it's not always just about alignment. It's about the other things around him to take the pressure off of him. And then the next step, like you said, and what we were going to say, I should say, is that next you're trying to use him almost as a deep and trying to scheme other guys.
Right. You're going to do that at times, right? Like, look, if they're going to, and I've talked about this in the past we had a situation where we were playing a team and we had three great receivers and they just said, hey, this one dude's not going to beat us. And then that game, he had 3 catches for 6 yards. But we destroyed that team and threw for well over 300 yards because we were able to then move him around where we wanted him to manipulate where that coverage was going to go so we could then create opportunities in other places. And I think that's where you're going to see a lot of the really exciting stuff from Tommy Rees. Is not just, oh, look at how well he did a good job of getting Michael Mayer open. That's going to be important, right? Like, that's a very important thing. You can't use the excuse of, well, they just, and Brian Kelly would do this, right? Well, they just took so-and-so out of the game. Well, F that. You got to figure out ways to get him going, right? You got to find out ways to say, okay, fine, then we're going to run a screen to him or we're going to do something to him to try to take advantage of that. You've got to get him the ball. But you also can't be so driven to force feeding him the ball that you then miss out on the opportunities to take advantage of what they're doing to him, which is, hey, look, I know that the way that they're looking at him, if we run him on a post route or run him right down the middle of the field from a slot formation, they are going to send both safeties on him. So here's what we're going to do out of that. Or if he's in this alignment and he runs a drag route, they're going to have like 3 guys basically eyeing him so we can do some other things to manipulate that. We can maybe do like a throwback or something like that. Like, hey, run Michael Mayer on a drag route so that backside linebacker kind of runs with him. They kind of lose our running back who we're going to put to the right, okay? Right. And because so it's like this. I have my tight end to the left and my running back to my right, okay? And I know that backside linebacker, if the back is over here and we run the tight end on a cross, that guy's going to be keying on Mayer the whole time. If we have back and tight end to the same side, that guy's going to have to also see my back. So what you do is you put your back opposite. He steps up and then slips out the backside, right? And now he's open, right? Those are the kind of things you need to be able to evaluate on film of how they play it so that if we use Mayer here's some opportunities based on how they cover him that we can open up some of those opportunities for Avery Davis or Braden Lindsey or the running backs or Lorenzo Styles and the running backs. And so that's going to be the fun part about it. But it all begins with Mayer has to go out and continue to prove, like, even if teams are focused on stopping him, he still has to prove that he can go make those plays. And I think one part of his game I'd like to see evolve a little bit is being able to win those contested throws down the field. He won one against Virginia, and he didn't come down with one against Oklahoma State. We didn't see him get a ton of those opportunities like we saw Tyler Eifert get a ton of those in 2012. I think that's an area I'd like to see kind of Michael Mayer be given opportunities is, hey, we're going to get you into this combination where they're going to have one guy on you. You have to be able to step up and make those plays in those situations. And I think he has it in him. I think he just needs an opportunity to do it more. And now he had a really good, according to Pro Football Focus, who, Ryan, I think you'd agree with me, their evaluation and some of their stuff is like just terrible, but they are good at data collection. I think that's an area where they shine. His contested catch rate was really impressive. Like, it was at well over 50%. He had one of the higher number of contested catches, but it's contested catches on like the short intermediate stuff is really where his contested catches were coming. There weren't a ton of downfield contested catches. But as we saw against Virginia, he can make some sick catches on throws downfield. And the one against Oklahoma State was as much about good defense. I mean, the guy just did a great job. Mayer had it, and the guy just knocked it out.
Sure.
Right? So I want to see him get more of those chances because those are going to be a part of it. It's going to be hard to get him where he's just wide open, especially early in the season. But you can manipulate him in a way to where you can at least maybe get a one-on-one, and he's got to be able to make those plays in those instances. So
yeah.
Mayer being the alpha is going to be a key part of this whole thing.
Yeah, it's not all going to be like that. What was that Florida State play, right, where he just leaked out wide open, nobody covered him,
just blown coverage. Yeah, like was first drive of the game, he runs a corner route and like nobody covers him, and it's like that may happen. That'll happen against like bad teams, right? You can't anticipate that happening against Ohio State or Clemson or Georgia or Alabama. It's that you got to earn it. Now, if those teams make mistakes, you make them pay. And that's the thing we did see with Michael Mayer and this offense last year's. Tommy Rees did as good of a job as I've seen of an offensive coordinator in a long time of if you're going to make a mistake, whether it be not so an execution standpoint, because you can't always predict that, but if you're going to make a mistake from an execution standpoint or a game plan standpoint or a matchup standpoint, I'm going to find it and I'm going to go at it. And he did a really nice job with that last year. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do now in year 2. Or year 3 as a coordinator with, I believe, his fastest group yet. And that's the thing. I think this is going to be his most explosive group of pass catchers that he's had, that Notre Dame has had since 2015 in the starting lineup. And I would argue there's more depth of those kind of guys in this group.
Yeah.
And we saw what that 2015 offense could do with all that speed.
Absolutely. And I think the thing that really excites me too, Brian, just to kind of have a final word on Michael Mayer for a second, is that, like you said, it's not perfect right now. It's absolutely not. Like the route running can improve, but then you still see some plays, man, where he just snaps it off and you're like, oh,
it's
okay.
there. Yes,
it's
there.
Absolutely there. Yeah.
It's there.
I mean, I've seen him win. I mean, there's 3 ways, in my opinion, to win as a separator, right? One is as a route runner, which you see the snap and you see the instant separation there. One is just as an athlete, being able to run past guys or just, quickness out, whatever, out of the stem. That stuff can be more natural than it is a separation because of a route runner. We've seen Michael Mayer do that plenty of times. Number 3 is the one that you just illustrated. Being able to elevate and win at the catch point, that is a form of separation. That is absolutely a form of separation. And I think people just kind of think like, wow, he uncovered deep. That's the only way you separate. Nope, that's not the only way you separate. There's multiple ways. If we have to get a more consistent approach from Michael Mayer to win in all 3 ways there, in all multiple levels, then you're talking about, hey, you have Braden Lindsey, who can absolutely fly and will take advantage of one-on-one matchups, who's shown the ability to uncover deep, just needs to win and, consistently finish, I should say.
Right.
Lorenzo Styles has shown the ability to win at multiple levels. There has been the flashes there. It's just now about the consistency factor. And, I mean, obviously coaching is a big part of that wide receiver conversation, right? Like it needs to be much more consistent, winning at the line of scrimmage, winning off of press, creating separation out of your stem. Like there's a lot of things that can go to that level, but I do think it all starts with Michael Mayer taking that next step, even though he's already a great football player, but I think it's a compliment to him to say he can get even better, which is fantastic.
I think the bowl game was a good example of that, Ryan. That combination of him working himself open and Notre Dame scheming him to get open. Because Oklahoma State's game plan was 87's not going to beat us. I mean, they tried their best to make sure he didn't beat them. And that's partly why Notre Dame had 3 other guys go over 100 yards in that game. Tyree went over 100 yards. Kevin Austin went over 100 yards, and Lorenzo Styles went over 100 yards. But Michael Mayer still had 7 catches for like 76 yards and 2 touchdowns. He still made his presence felt. And it was the combination of those 2 things. It was you were able to scheme him into a couple situations where you could get him in one-on-ones, but then in those one-on-ones, for example, the first touchdown, the drag route, he just outran the guy. I mean, he stemmed him up and then snapped it across, which is part route running, but then just outran the guy. And even though they had a plan, it didn't matter because Michael Mayer is still going to get his. But that's the key. That was one of the best games I've seen from Michael Mayer, even though his production wasn't great. Now, I would have liked to see him come down with that one wheel route that got broken up. But again, sometimes you have to be able to tip your cap and say, that guy made a really good play on the ball, right? The defensive player made a good play. It happens sometimes, but that was an example of even when you focus on him, he can still hurt you if other guys step up. And that's the key, because Tyree first play of the game catches a swing route, takes it 20+ yards. Lorenzo Styles finishes that drive off with a post route, blown coverage, because they were kind of keying on Michael Mayer, and Lorenzo just beat the guy deep. And then of course they come with a blitz and they hit Chris Tyree for a touchdown. It's 14-7, and you're just like, okay, Michael Mayer hasn't done a darn thing yet, and they just put 2 scores on the board on us, right? And that kind of hurt a little bit at times what they wanted to do at Oklahoma State. So I think those are the things that we kind of got a glimpse of that. And you referenced the Oklahoma State game earlier. Obviously, Notre Dame needs to be able to run the ball better. They were not going to run the ball that game. We're not saying they should have run the ball more that game. They couldn't. They were not running on Oklahoma State. They just weren't. I think this year will be different, but I think that'll help as well. But a thing that I also want to see from them is I want to see more in the pass game out of play action this year. I want to see the play action game get better. And I understand why it couldn't be great last year. And a lot of their play action passes were just kind of like the kind of little half-hearted, play action. I think that's where we're going to see some of Michael Mayer's big plays, because if the run game is what we think it'll be and hope it'll be, that's the great equalizer for you trying to game plan to stop Michael Mayer. Because on a play action, you can't necessarily do both of defend him with multiple guys and have enough bodies to stop the run. I think that's where we could see schematically Tommy Rees have some real creative ways to get Michael Mayer the football down the field.
Mm-hmm.
And so those will be interesting to see. So obviously Michael Mayer being the alpha is going to be stepping up, is going to be a big part of that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's all about attacking leverage, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're an offensive player. So I'm just imagining, I want people to kind of imagine for a second what Brian's talking about. It's like, hey, Michael Mayer off a play action, just running, let's just say like a quick little inside seam route. They're going to sink the linebacker underneath. They're going to play the safety over top. Well, if that linebacker has to really worry about that run action, he's going to be late to sinking, which gives you inside leverage to the play. Or if a safety gets frozen and has to work over top of something, then you have outside leverage.
Right.
Offense, football is a pretty easy game, man. It's a numbers game, and it's ability to attack leverage. That's really what it is, and that's where that play action game comes into, the ability to attack certain leverages.
And it's funny because when I was a receivers coach, that was the first rule of thumb out of the stance was attack his leverage. If he's playing you inside, there's a reason. If he's playing you outside, there's a reason. You need to attack his leverage to either A, get him to determine that his leverage at the snap was just a decoy because he's really doing this. And if you don't attack his leverage, then you're not doing that. And then number 2 is that's how you manipulate a guy as you get to your top end. So yes. And then as a play caller, play designer, it's how can we gain leverage in numbers or leverage in sort of an alignment standpoint. It's all leverage is a huge part of football. From a play calling standpoint and from an execution of that play calling with your technique. And so those are the things, is like you said, if the run game is legitimately good, it's really hard to defend a good, well-designed and well-executed play action pass when you have a guy like a Michael Mayer.
Yep.
And that's going to be the key. And then you talk about the speed that's running around him. That's the other piece of this is, in the past, when Notre Dame's had bigger tight ends, a lot of times they've kind of had a bigger group of receivers around him, and I think one of the things that should help this team is Michael Mayer is going to have the benefit of having a lot of speed around him, completely different skill sets around him. And I think that could benefit him depending on how the offense goes. And to your point, Ryan, it's about the usage. And one thing about that is if Notre Dame is crushing teams with the RPOs and the quick games and the perimeter screens, you have to start cheating your linebacker out, which then opens up those option routes and those that short to intermediate stuff for Michael Mayer. And that's where it starts to get fun. So, but Ryan, I think that also includes you have to have other guys step up and make plays. Because if you're just going to consistently throw RPOs and my guys are catching it, getting tackled at 5 yards, that's not making me get off of my Michael Mayer plan, right?
Yep.
So the receivers have to step up. So as we kind of talk about the receivers, there's 2 veterans, Ryan, that have a chance this spring to kind of really establish themselves into important roles. And that is Braden Lindsey, who we expected, and then Joe Wilkins, who we didn't necessarily expect to be in that role because we were unsure if Joe Wilkins is going to be 100% by the time spring came around, because he did get injured in October. And so spring was kind of at the very beginning of when he might start kind of coming back. And so he's coming back 100%, which was a big surprise. So to me, those 2 guys, and we'll get into the young guys, but those 2 guys have to step up. This can't be just the sophomores. Those 2 guys provide some unique things. And let's begin with Braden Lindsey.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's a player on the roster. You could make this case from just a position coach standpoint, his position coach. So like I've argued that the guy that's going to benefit the most from the overall coaching changes is Chris Tyree. Not because of Coach McCullough. And this is no shot at Coach McCullough. It's more about it's because of Harry Heastand. That's not his position coach. I'm talking about who's going to benefit the most from their specific position coach. I think a case could be made that it's going to be it could be Braden Lindsey. The reason I say that is because Braden Lindsey is a really dynamic player athletically. We've seen it. I mean, we've seen him do it on the field. This isn't just like, well, we saw him at this one practice. We've seen him do it on the field, right, against Power 5 teams, USC, Georgia Tech. No, it's not Georgia Tech, Stanford. We've seen him do it against, I'm trying to remember, Boston College. We've seen him do it, against a ranked Navy team, not Power 5, but a ranked Navy team in 2019. We've seen flashes of it, but it's been a while. 2020 due to injury. This year, it's because teams kind of figured out with Braden Lindsey, number one, they aren't running a bunch of reverses and stuff to him. They did a couple later in the year, and he had a 30-something yard gain on it, but they just weren't doing that. They used him as a pure receiver this year. And the problem with that is Braden Lindsey doesn't know how to play the game. He was never taught how to play the game from a technical standpoint. So what teams were doing, Ryan, is they were just coming down and beating him up at the line of scrimmage and saying, we're gonna be physical with him, and we're going to beat him up, and he's not going to be able to outrun us enough by the time the ball comes out to be able to make that play. And so there were plenty of times this year where Braden Lindsey was coming open deep a lot of times, but it was always a second later than it should be because he got beat up at the line. And the result was the quarterback had already gone away from that because he was getting roughed up. And, so he was such a raw, I mean, you've seen the all 22, we've both seen it. He's such a raw route runner, even for a senior, that it's kind of an embarrassment to the position coach that that was the case. One of the things we had in our intel piece on offense a couple of weeks ago was the receiver that when I just asked a source, I said, hey, talk to me about receiver. It was the first name he brought up. He's like, he's having a phenomenal offseason. And so talking about how hard because that's the big thing is does Braden want it? And he was working hard and all those type of things. But that's a guy that Chancey Stuckey has kind of taken as a project. Like, I got to get this guy going because Braden has the tools to be a dynamic player, but it's important for him, Ryan, because he doesn't have like supernatural hands. So he's going to have some of those openings where he's catching the ball with space. And when you're not a good route runner against the good teams, you're just not going to be put in those situations. And so that's a guy that for me, Chancey Stuckey is going to earn his paycheck or not, beginning with that guy. And he is a big, big key because Braden Lindsey will never be, in my opinion, a 60-plus catch guy. I don't think that's who he is. He doesn't have to be.
No.
I mean, Justin Ross had a huge impact on Clemson in 2018. I mean, a huge impact. Like, he was a huge, huge part of that offense. He was just an absolute monster and all those type of things. I'm not comparing him to Justin Ross. Just follow me here. He caught 46 passes. That's it. In 15 games. But he had 1,000 yards.
Right.
Because he averaged 21.7 yards a catch. I'm not saying Braden Lindsey is Justin Ross. I'm simply making the point that if you use him correctly, he doesn't need 70 catches to have a game-changing impact. He can have 3 or 4 a game and have a game-changing impact. And so to me, he's got to put in the work this offseason, but they also have to do 2 things as coaches. Teach him how to play and say, hey, look, we have to find ways to get Braden Lindsey the football in different ways every single game, whether he's playing 20 snaps or 50 snaps. If Braden Lindsey's not getting touches, that's on us at this point in time as coaches.
Yeah, I've been calling for the Braden Lindsey breakout for a few years here, right? And you still have hope, though, and it sounds silly going into his 5th year, right? But, like, you still have hope because, like you said, the natural athleticism is easy to see. Like, you can't teach that stuff. It's the stuff that you can teach that just has not been on par to this moment, right? So you have hope that Braden Lindsey can take that jump. And I do believe that he really can, because if Braden Lindsey takes that step, you know that he can do the gadget stuff. You know that you can work a reverse in and end around in. You know, you can give a jet sweep occasionally. You could do all those types of things. But also RPO action, big time for me, man. Like getting this guy in space early, because you mentioned the hands, right? Like, he's never going to be a guy that is a contested
Right.
catch type of dude.
Not
Like,
a
he's not
lot.
going to be that.
Yeah, he's had a
just
couple, the
right,
Cincinnati game, but there's a
right,
lot more that he didn't catch
right.
than
Well,
that one.
he's
Correct.
just got a smaller frame, and it's
Right.
just not his game,
Right.
and that's fine. You don't have to be a contested catch guy, but if you are a guy that can uncover deep, which he can, we've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
He can uncover deep. He can run after the catch. So he tells me that he can work the RPO game and he can be that gadget dude. If you get just I want to say even modest improvement as a route runner, you just create a little bit of separation.
Yeah.
I think he could have a huge impact. If he takes a
Right.
huge step forward, then Braden Lindsey could be the surprise star of the team this year. Like he could be the second leading receiver on this team. He could be that type of impact
yardage
player.
wise. Right.
Yardage wise. Yeah, not as a volume receiver. I'm talking about a guy that, hey, he had 85 yards this game, but he only had 3 catches, right? Like he's got that type of game breaking ability. So and they need that element because I think Lorenzo Styles gives you some home run ability. But outside of that, you got a bunch of more of guys that I think are closer to volume guys than breakaway type of dudes.
Yes.
So you need that speed element on your offense.
Michael Mayer's a volume guy.
Sure.
Dion Colzi's a volume. It doesn't mean that those guys can't hit big plays. It's not a criticism. It just means that's just more of where their game is. And when you look at a guy like Braden Lindsey, for example, and you talked about Lorenzo Styles, Ryan, and I think that's a big one for me because when I look at Lorenzo Styles, I say, yeah, I think Lorenzo Styles can be a home run player. I think Lorenzo Styles, and we'll get into him here in a little bit more, but I also think Lorenzo Styles can be a guy that can be a volume guy. I think he can be an every down pass catcher. I think he can do both of those things. However, especially as a sophomore, I don't know if I want to go into the season with Lorenzo Styles having to be sort of that put the offense or the receiving core on your shoulders kind of guy. I don't know if I necessarily want him doing that. And so to me, it's about can you take some of the pressure off of him? And so, Avery Davis should be able to help do that in the fall, but you're not going to have Avery Davis this spring. And we're kind of focusing on the spring. So this spring, it's about, okay, a guy like Braden Lindsey steps up and he can be sort of that take the top off the defense guy. Then what that does with you in Lorenzo Styles is that gives you so many more options with what you can do with Lorenzo Styles. So if Michael Mayer is what he is, and Braden Lindsey is what we think he can be, which is that stretch the field, just do things where you're doing one of 3 things with Braden Lindsey. One is you're having him stretch the field. Number 2 is you get him in sort of chase routes. And I love Braden Lindsey in chase routes, drags, crossers, things like that. And number 3 is just getting him the ball behind the line of scrimmage, whether it be screens, reverses, or jets, right? If you're doing those things with Braden Lindsey and he's able to take the top off the defense, then that allows you with Lorenzo Styles. And Ryan, the point that I'm making is that Lorenzo Styles can be that stretch the field guy, but he's more of a volume guy, in my opinion, that you can do a lot of different things with. And so if Braden can be that vertical player that teams have to respect, now all of a sudden you can now utilize Lorenzo's speed on a lot of different things. You can really use him on the crossers, the drags. I think a guy whose game, and I'm not saying he's as good of a player, so just hear me on this, but how you can use him, in my opinion, is a lot like how Alabama used Devontae Smith in 2020. Meaning, again, not the same player. I'm comparing their usage, meaning Devontae would play slot. He'd play outside field. He'd play outside boundary. He could stretch the field, but a lot of Devontae's big plays were on stuff across the field where somebody else was taking the top off and he was coming underneath and on a drag and a deep cross, right? And so I think those are things that Lorenzo, because he is a good route runner, he kind of gets across, get vertical, stem that guy up, and then snap him out. Now you're outrunning him. As Braden Lindsey's taking the top off one side, Michael Mayer with a wheel route's taking the top off the other side. So I think those things aren't as effective, however, if you don't have another legitimate deep threat to take the pressure off. And that's where Braden Lindsey comes into effect, where that's the thing is if Braden's in the game and he only touches it 3 times, that doesn't mean he only impacted the game 3 times. If he proves himself to be a legitimate big play guy, now all of a sudden when he does a jet sweep, you're a little bit more nervous about it. When he does run a post route, you got to pay a little bit more attention to it. When you do have him in cover 1 out there, you may have to think, hey, we may not want to come press here because the last time we pressed him, he beat this guy. And then because here's the thing, if Braden Lindsey learns how to beat a press, he will crush people. Because if he beats you off the line, you have no chance. None. He will just run by you. And it just, he didn't know how to beat a press. Just no clue. He would run around guys. Well, you're playing right in the defense's hands. So that's my thing is he can be that guy that even though he's not a volume guy, which we both agree on that doesn't mean that he can't impact the game. And that's where then all of a sudden Lorenzo Styles and Avery Davis and those kind of guys start getting, and the running backs start getting into more favorable matchups because you can't just double team everybody, And so that's why I think Braden Lindsey having a big season. And again, when I say big season, I'm not talking about volume. I'm not talking about 1,000 yards. I'm not talking about 60 touches. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just saying where his talent finally shows up in every week, where he's going to make a play or two every week, where it gets to the point where pretty early in the season, like for me, I'm taking a shot to Braden Lindsey early in the game against Ohio State. Because if he's either open, even if it's an incomplete pass, you have to say, yeah, we're not taking that chance again, because next time the quarterback may hit him. You have to alter what you're doing. And now all of a sudden that's where things work out, where I want every team. And if you hit it, of course, that's a huge one, right? Because that kind of speed can say defense have to say, yeah, I know this guy isn't a volume guy. He's only on the field half the time because of, the number of reps he gets. But when he's on the field, we got to make sure we account for him, because Braden Lindsey can do with one catch what it's going to take most receivers to do with 3 or 4. And that's the key. So again, it just adds to all the different aspects of what it takes to have a great receiving core, not just a great player like a Michael Mayer. So I do think this is a big spring for Braden Lindsey, because here's the thing. We are both predicting a breakout, Ryan, and we've done so for a while now. But if you go through another spring and he's not that guy, eventually you have to start saying, okay, we need to think about somebody else stepping into that role. We can't keep trying to force feed this when he's just not healthy or not making plays or whatever. So it is a big spring for the coaching staff with Braden Lindsey, but this is a big spring for Braden Lindsey too. He's got to step up and say, hey man, you're getting the coaching now, go do something with it. And if he can do that this spring, if Braden Lindsey kind of starts being the player we think he can be, and Michael Mayer's the player he thinks he can be, and then you look at the sophomore class, we're going to get into Lorenzo here in a second. Now you start thinking like, okay, this is an offense that's going to be really hard to stop. And now back to the original point you made, Ryan. Now all of a sudden Tom Reese is talking like, okay, you know what? I've got my whole arsenal now. I can do anything I want now because of this. And that could make this Notre Dame offense extremely, extremely dangerous.
Yep. Give yourself options, man. That's what it is. I mean, when are offensive coordinators at their best? When they have multiple players that they can attack, and multiple levels they can attack, and multiple things that they can do in the arsenal. Like that's where when you give a coordinator options, because I mean I've been on teams, Brian, where just weren't very good, and like there was like one thing you could do well, and outside of that it wasn't great. And like you would have, of course, some parents in the stands that are like, why are you running this play over and over again? It's like, buddy, we can't do anything else. What do you want me to say about it? Like we literally can't. It handicaps some play callers so much, man. So options are the key.
Look at the bowl game.
Yeah.
Look at the bowl game. I mean, eventually against a good defense like Oklahoma State, if you can't run the ball, eventually we're going to be able to force enough incompletions that we can win the game. Like you said, you have to be able to do a little bit of everything. So 100% right. And then Joe Wilkins, his role to me, Joe is getting him back is going to be great because he provides leadership.
Yes.
And I know Braden's a 5th-year senior, but I want Braden focused on Braden this spring. I want him worried about himself and getting his game. Joe can provide leadership, but Joe also should benefit from Chancey Stuckey. I don't think Joe Wilkins is a very good route runner either. He's going to benefit from that a little bit. He's a good athlete. He's a better athlete than his separation would otherwise show, in my opinion. And he's going to have to catch the ball better. That's the other thing. He's going to have to be a guy that goes out there and makes plays and says, hey, look, when we're going to throw you the ball, you need to break. I mean, I think of like the drop he had against Syracuse in 2020 and, just some other opportunity. Made the great play against Florida State for a touchdown, but there's been too many times where Joe just hasn't been able to haul it in. Being a better route runner helps with that because you get a little bit more separation. You're not always catching contested throws. But Joe's going to have to step up this spring, Ryan, and make plays. And that's what's so big for him being able to come back this spring is if you go a whole spring where you can't really practice and Dion and Lorenzo Styles are getting all those reps, Jaden Thomas are getting those reps, you may not have a job when you come back. It's big for him to be able to just compete for a job, but he's got to improve his game if he's going to be a key part of this rotation this spring.
Yeah, and he's one of the few guys, Brian, on the roster, honestly, right now that you say you've seen flashes of winning those contested catches, right? Like those 50-50 balls, and it has not been consistent at all, but he has some length to him. He's very smooth, and there's times where he plucks the football really well. So I want to see obviously him take a big step because I mean honestly right now I don't know if you're depending on Joe Wilkins to be one of the guys this year, right? Like it feels like to me, and it's just my opinion, that he might be in a position where he just gets passed up by a couple guys. But if he's able to take that step and be a player
Right.
that we think his talent can indicate, then that's a huge bonus to this offense,
Right.
man. That gives you even more options because I don't think you're really depending on Joe Wilkins. But if you can,
Right.
then whoa, man, now we're working with a lot of options.
As a receivers coach, here's how this matters to me. If I got 4 guys for 3 spots, they're going to get a lot of work. And by November, they're going to be worn out, right? If I have 5 or 6 guys for 3 spots, and what that means is not just having bodies, right? I can have bodies. What I'm talking about is when I put Joe Wilkins, let's say I'm Chancey Stuckey, right? And I look a lot different than Chancey Stuckey, but let's pretend for a second that I'm Chancey Stuckey. And or I have his role. And I'm looking into it. I'm saying, okay, I know I can give Joe 25 snaps a game. He's not going to do a whole lot in those 25 snaps. That hurts my offense because in those 25 snaps, I don't have a guy that's going to really do any damage to a defense. So they're going to give him one-on-ones and just isolate him and take whoever else is on the field out of the game. And if he can't do anything except catch the occasional hitch route and things like that, then in those 25 snaps, if I'm going to play him, I have to understand, okay, we've taken one weapon off the field. Okay. And so, yeah, we may save my guys' legs, but in games against Ohio State and Clemson and USC and BYU and teams like that, that's going to hurt us as an offense. So we may have to up the volume of the regulars, right? The guys that are making plays. So then by the fourth quarter, my receivers aren't as fresh, right? I need to have guys that if I'm putting you on the field, I need to know that, hey, Coach Reese, hey, you got Joe on the field. What can I call? Whatever you called last series. He's good. He may not be as dynamic as Dion or whoever else, but look, call to plays. He knows what to do. He can run routes. He's going to catch the ball, right? So you can still do things with him, okay? And that's going to be an important thing for Joe. Joe's going to play this year, but is he going to be a guy that gives a breather to the guys in the rotation, or is he a guy that you can say, hey, look, I can take 5 to 10 reps off of Dion Colzi and Lorenzo Styles and Avery Davis because Joe can play all 3 spots, in my opinion. I mean, his skill set projects to all 3 spots. So he may not be the full-time rotation guy, W or X or Z, but he can play each of those in a role. He's a good blocker. And then if he's in the game, you can still run your offense. So you don't lose a ton when he's on the field. That's what Joe Wilkins has to prove himself to be, Ryan, because if he's not, then he's going to be a guy that maybe plays a lot against Cal and Marshall and Navy and UNLV and Syracuse, but he's not a guy you're going to put on the field a lot in those bigger games without having some negative consequences. And that's why this is a big spring for Joe. I think he's got it in him to be that kind of guy. Where, again, he's not a 70-catch, 1,000-yard guy, but, hey, look, you leave him in a one-on-one, that guy better be pretty good because Joe's pretty good. And I think that's what he's got to prove himself to be this spring, right? I don't think he's proven that yet. I think what he's been on film so far is what you had said before, just kind of just a guy, right, that just out there taking reps and, kind of taking some of the pressure, but not a guy that's going to scare you a whole lot.
Sure.
I think he can be better than that. He's going to get the coaching to allow him to be better than that, because for guys like him that aren't elite athletes, it's even more important that their technique be sound.
Sure.
And so I think that's another guy that should benefit from improved coaching. And then if he can build on that part of his game and catch the ball better, now all of a sudden you have a guy like, hey, look, I got no problem putting Joe Wilkins in the game and giving this guy a breather, that guy a breather, that guy a breather, and we still run our offense, because Joe can play. But it's a big spring, because if he doesn't prove that by the end of the spring, to your point, Ryan, they're going to have no problem putting Dion Colzi and Jaden Thomas and Tobias Merriweather or a second tight end, a second back, a third tight end in the field ahead of him, because you have enough depth at those other positions that I don't have to play my fifth receiver if he's not doing something, So it's a big spring for Joe Wilkins.
Well, and I think for both of them, Brian, I want to see if you agree with this. It's like I think of a guy like an Avery Davis for a second, right? Like he could play some X in this offense, right? But for the majority, you're going to want him to be a slot receiver. And there's a couple other players that I think are best suited for one spot. Yeah. I think that Braden Lindsey could play X, he could play in the slot particularly, right? Like he has some flexibility. You just mentioned Joe Wilkins could play all over the place in theory from a skill set perspective. So at worst, both these players, in my opinion, could be valuable assets in the ability to have different alignment possibilities. You can be a little more diverse in how you line up. And I mean, if Joe Wilkins ends up being a really darn good backup to 3 different spots, that's fine. That's awesome.
Right.
But if he takes the next step, then, I mean, it's just an added bonus, in my opinion.
Right. I think he can play all 3 spots to some degree. I think that Jaden Thomas can play all 3 spots to some degree. And I think that Lorenzo Styles can play all 3 spots to some degree. And I think there's value to that. And I think Tobias Merriweather can play both outside spots. I mean, so I think Dion Colzi right now at this stage of his career, I just kind of want him to focus on the W. You know, like I would kind of limit him. Just let's get him comfortable there. Then we can kind of branch him out to do some different things with him. But a lot of those other guys certainly can do that.
Sure.
So let's talk sophomores, Ryan. Let's talk about the sophomore class. The reality is for everything we just said about Joe Wilkins and Braden Lindsey and what we'll talk about Avery Davis more this summer when he gets back into the rotation, you know, those guys are all good players. You can have a good receiving core with those. If those 3 guys are your starters, you're going to have a good receiving core with Michael Mayer. If you include Michael Mayer, you can have a good receiving core. But if this is going to be a great receiving core or a receiving core capable of being part of a championship football team, the sophomore class has to emerge. And I think at least 2 of them do. Now, they don't have to emerge as they're your number 1 and 2 receivers, but at least 2 of them have to be – one has to emerge as a guy, and another has to emerge as just what we talked about with Joe Wilkins. You know, Dion doesn't have to play 50 snaps a game if he's not ready yet, but if we're going to put him on the field for 20, looking at it from a coaching staff standpoint, we need to know that he's going to be able to play and help us and make plays and do all those kind of things. And so the sophomore class with those 2 plus Jaden Thomas, their development this offseason is really going to determine whether this is a good pass game or a great pass game. I really believe that. And at the top, Ryan, it all starts with Lorenzo Styles.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, and it's funny, man. This sophomore class just in general from a wider scope. I know we're just focusing on wide receivers.
It's
like
sick.
This, both the short and long term, man, it is a instrumental class potentially, not only for this year, but I mean, looking to 2023 and beyond, right? Like it's just so much talent in that class, especially on the offensive side of football. You mentioned Lorenzo Styles. For me, I keep picking him as that breakout star, right? And it's a little bit of a cheating one because we've seen the glimpses, right? Like we've seen him already have the moments where you're like, yeah, that's big time stuff. But he really does give you that flexibility where he's a matchup dictator, man. Like you put him in the slot, you put him at Z, you put him at X, like it doesn't matter. You can put him a little bit of everywhere and you can create wherever your matchup you feel like if he takes that step. Because right now, I think we saw last year, at worst, he could be a darn good secondary option. But I think that the ceiling for him is that he could be, when all said and done, the unquestioned number 1 receiver on this team right now. He could be.
Right. Well, when you look at the bowl game, for example, and the success he had against Oklahoma State, and I want to put this in the context of how good the receiving core as a whole played in that game when it came to just production. They had 3 guys go for 100 yards in that game. The entire season, 12 regular season games plus the Big 12 title game. Oklahoma State allowed 1 player to go over 100 yards. 1 all year. Not Mario Williams, none of them. It was 1 guy from Iowa State. And Notre Dame had 3. Okay. And Lorenzo's had the most production. He had 8 catches for 136 yards, but he was a complementary weapon in that game. The offense wasn't built around him. It was, you know, Austin was making his plays and Mayer was getting a lot of focal point, and they took advantage of Lorenzo with that. And the game was really the ideal shows like what he can be. Like if you're just going to try to treat this kid as a complimentary player, he's going to torch you. And that's exactly what he did to Oklahoma State. And, you know, he can be that kind of guy. And to your point about the breakout, I mean, yeah, I mean, you could say he had 24 catches for 344 yards, but what we're saying is that a breakout's not 35 catches for 500 yards. A breakout can be similar to what we've seen from past sophomores. I mean, look, Golden Tate went from 6 catches as a freshman to 1,000 yards as a sophomore. Will Fuller did that. You know, we've seen several guys. Equinemi St. Brown went from 1 catch as a freshman to 50-plus catches for almost 1,000 yards as a sophomore. Would have had 1,000 if they would have qualified for a bowl game. So we've seen guys do that. Chase Claypool went from 5 catches to in 2016 to being a 20 plus 400 catch guy the next year as part of an offense that didn't even throw the ball that much in 2017. So we've seen guys kind of like have those breakouts as sophomores, and Lorenzo had way more production as a true freshman than all those guys. And so it's certainly the talent is there, and the way he had finished the season, obviously in the bowl game, was impressive. I think the thing that makes him also special and unique is he's a pure receiver. Like Braden Lindsey's like an athlete, and but Avery Davis is a converted guy that's learning. But Lorenzo is a pure receiver, and what I mean by that is not only can you move him all around, but there's so many different things he can do within the offense. He can stretch the field vertically. He's got really good body control. He's got to learn to he's got to get stronger in order to win some of those contested catches. We didn't see him get a ton of chances to do that, but he showed like the wheel route where they kind of back shouldered him against Oklahoma State. He flipped his hips around. Like I was there, I'm watching this route development. I don't know if the TV, because I watched it yesterday. I don't know if the TV copy does justice to how much he had to flip his hips to get back to that football on that particular play. He can run short routes. He can run. He's a good, for a freshman, he was a really good route runner. I think there's a lot of room for improvement as he matures. The expectations get higher for him, but he's got a lot of natural route running ability. He can run crossers. He can run drags. He can do the chase routes. He can run stick routes. He can do a lot of different things you want. He showed in the bowl game he can effectively catch and then make plays after the catch in the RPO game. He did that too. Was it USC or North Carolina? It was North Carolina where he caught just like a little quick screen, made one guy miss, and just ran for a big play. I believe it was against North Carolina. And he showed that again in the bowl game. So there's really nothing he can't do. And I think that's what makes him potentially so dangerous, because not only can you play him all over, he can run your entire route tree physically and skill set wise. There's nothing you can't say, well, with him in the game, I'm not sure if we want to do that. There's things you don't necessarily want to ask Braden Lindsey to do. There's things you're not going to ask Avery Davis to do. There's things you're not going to want Dion Colzi to do. There's nothing in your offense that I can think of that you can't ask Lorenzo Styles to do, in theory, based on his skill set.
Sure.
And that's going to be the thing for me. And that's why I compared him to Devontae Smith. Again, I'm not comparing him to Devontae Smith as a player. I'm not saying he's going to have 98 catches for 1,500 yards and win the Heisman. I'm just saying, like, when you look at a guy like that you can plug into all three of your receiver spots, and then a guy that can run the entire gamut of routes from those spots, it makes it really hard for defenses to defend that guy. And that's what I see from Lorenzo Styles. And even though he's not a real big kid, he's a lot stronger than you'd think. And that's why I think he can be a really effective one-on-one contested catch guy with more experience. And number two, why he's so good after the catch, because he's not going to just come down by the first guy that hits him in the knee. You know what I mean? He's a tough kid too. So this is a guy that if there's anybody at receiver that I could say who has the best chance to become the guy, right? Like not like the leading receiver of a group of three, but the guy opposite Michael Mayer. I mean, he's the best option for me. We talked about maybe Dion Colzi could be that guy because of the position he plays, and the W in the past has been sort of the volume position. But if they run the offense the way that I think and hope they do, we're going to see Lorenzo get some stuff in that spot too. And that's why I think at the end of the day, he's the guy that I think has the best chance of really emerging as the guy at receiver. And if that happens, it's going to take a lot of pressure off Michael Mayer. It's going to take pressure off Braden Lindsey. It's going to take pressure off Avery Davis, off Dion Colzi, off the run game, because he's a guy that I'm really looking forward to seeing in some play action. Because if he gets one-on-ones and if he can just win at the top end of his route or win at the line, you can't run with him. I mean, he's surprisingly, I think his speed is deceptive. I think he is a home run threat. I don't know if he's 4.3 fast, but I guarantee he's 4.4 fast. And a guy like that is going to be a major weapon. So I think Lorenzo could be the guy that, of all the players we talked about, could be that guy that becomes the next dude at wide receiver for Notre Dame. The Golden Tate, Michael Floyd, Will Fuller dude, not the TJ Jones dude. Like TJ was a great player, but TJ kind of grew into that by his senior year. And it was more about he used TJ Jones in 2013 was more about savviness, and he was a good route runner, how to get open. He wasn't like that guy's just scaring you the way that Tate, Fuller, Floyd, those guys did. I think Lorenzo can be more of that than a TJ Jones type of 1,000-yard receiver. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, no, I agree completely. And the reason that I keep saying I think Styles is going to be that guy is because it reminds me similarly, and I'm not comparing them as players because I think they're very different. But this is the reason why I love Garrett Wilson so much in the 2022 class, because it's like Garrett Wilson can win as a route runner all day. He can win as an athlete. He just ran 4.38 at the combine, whatever it was. He can also win surprisingly well as a catch point guy down the field. And then he also can win as a yak receiver. Like when you put all those things together, you literally have a player that can win in every single way and can win at every level of the defense. We're talking about a guy that can uncover short, intermediate, and deep. And I think of that similarly to how I think of Lorenzo Styles. I think that he can win in every single way, kind of like you illustrated on the football field. And that guy, for me, if he hits a ceiling, that's the best wide receiver potentially, because there's just not like it's not a
you can't take him out of the game, Ryan. You can't take him out of the game in that regards. If you can play go ahead. Yeah. I mean, if you can play all those positions and do everything out of it, it's almost impossible to take him out of the game unless, go back to your original point, unless you have a guy like a Jalen Ramsey who can just mirror him wherever he goes and he's just better than he is. It's really hard to take him out of the game if he can do those things.
Well, and that was the final point I was getting to. It's like, I mean, in theory,
I had to steal your thunder.
No, it was a really good segue, honestly, because I was just thinking about different cornerback body types for a second. I'm like, okay, let's put a big long guy on him that beat him up. Well, he's too quick and he's too good of a potentially of a route runner to be that guy because he can just create a separation. Okay, well, let's put a quick twitch guy, and then he doesn't have the length that maybe he can really stick with him as far as at the catch point and down the field tracking the football. So it's really like a double-edged sword, man. Like you just can't, there's no way that you're just going to eliminate every part of his game. He can just win in so many different ways. That's why if he's a complementary piece and he hits close to his ceiling with a Michael Mayer, like good luck trying to cover one of those guys one-on-one, because there's going to be a one-on-one at some point with either Michael Mayer and Lorenzo Styles if he hits his ceiling. And if both those guys are playing to their peaks, good luck to whoever you're giving a one-on-one matchup to.
Yeah, it starts kind of getting fun, and then you start talking about Dion Colzi emerging, and when Tobias Merriweather shows up in the fall. We won't talk about Tobias a whole lot other than stuff like that now. And I think the Garrett Wilson comparison is very intriguing too, because again, there's some differences in their skill sets and styles, but very similar body types. I mean, Garrett Wilson surprisingly won a lot of one-on-one catches for a guy that's 6 foot, 185, 190 pounds, right? Like he's not a big guy. And you kind of look at what he did as a freshman, 30 catches, 432 yards, 5 touchdowns, 14.4 yards per catch. And that was in 14 games. You compare that to what Lorenzo Styles did this last year, 24 catches, 344 yards, 14.3 yards per catch. Also had a couple runs. I mean, it's similar first year impact. And then of course, Garrett Wilson went out the next year and was outstanding. Now he had 43 catches for 723 yards and 6 touchdowns, but that was only in 8 games because of COVID. I mean, you project him over the course of a 13, 14 game season, he's well over 1,000 yards as a second-year player, and probably has 10 touchdowns as a second-year player. And then, of course, this past year, when you consider his production relative to just how many guys they had catching passes, 70 catches for 1,000 yards and 12 touchdowns. And they have 3 guys went over 1,000 yards this year. Did Olave go over 1,000 as well? I mean, I know that Smith and Jigba did. No, Olave only had 936.
Olave actually, weird one there. He never went over 1,000 yards in all 4 of his seasons. A little weird of a out there.
I don't find that super surprising, although let's be honest, he would have gone over 1,000 in 2020 if it wasn't for COVID. He had over 700 yards in 7 games. I mean,
he would have went over this year too if not for the injury at some point,
right?
So,
because he played 12 games, but that's what happens sometimes when you have that many dudes at receiver. But what made Ohio State's offense so difficult last year was some teams actually did a decent job of limiting how much Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave could do. And so what happens? Jackson Smith and Jigba destroys you. It just, when you have that many weapons that can not just make plays, but like take over a game, it's impossible to defend. And that's why we say it's important for other guys to step up. Now, they can be good if just, hey, we got 4 or 5 guys that if you take Mayer out, one of them's going to step up. But if you know every week that Mayer and Styles are going to bring it, and then it's Avery or Braden or Dion Colzi or Jane Thomas or Tobias can be that third guy. I mean, third and fourth guy. I mean, how do you defend that? I mean, it's impossible.
Not only that, because like, I mean, obviously you're talking about like, hey, oh, there's a secondary pass catcher, but also I think of Ohio State. I mean, Travion Henderson had such easy production sometimes because defenses have to play too high against those types of teams because like you just have to keep two safeties deep because you're just like so many weapons. You just can't keep bringing the extra guy down in the box.
You either have to keep two safeties deep or you have to back your corners off and then widen out your linebackers.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And then you bracket them that way. Either way, it's a huge bust of the run game because one says, hey, we're going to be able to run at you and you got your safeties. And the other one says, we're going to have a lot of creases, vertical creases, because you're trying to catch a guy that can run like Travion Henderson. You're trying to have that guy come from over top of number 2 and catch him on an inside zone. It ain't happening. You know what I mean? And Notre Dame has that.
You know who else is pretty fast in a backfield setting as well as there's this guy that runs 4.3 something.
Plays for Notre Dame, number 25, Chris Tyree.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, that guy.
Just think about Chris Tyree with light boxes, man.
Right.
Just dream about it.
And that's the point is that's how these guys can impact this offense. I mean, if you're worried about Braden taking the top off and Lorenzo, because Lorenzo's going to play slot, he's going to play outside, he's going to play boundary. You've got to worry about Michael Mayer, and all of a sudden you have to start kind of widening out because Notre Dame's using the RPOs and they're just gashing you, and you're like, man, we can't keep letting these guys get in space and doing these type of things. All of a sudden, that's the one time Notre Dame either runs it inside zone and Chris Tyree creases it, or that time where you go 12 personnel and you have your 2 tight ends backside and they're widened out to the field and they're going to come up and run with your tight ends, and so you run that read zone, and all of a sudden Tyler Buckner's pulling that thing outside the back door and there's nobody out there. You know what I mean? And so that's when I wrote the article the other day, like speed is not going to be a problem for this Notre Dame offense. If this offense isn't productive, it won't because they don't have enough speed. It'll be because of other reasons. You can't tell me an offense where Tyler Buckner and Chris Tyree and Braden Lindsey and Lorenzo Styles and Avery Davis. And I know I'm sure you've heard things from draft people about Avery Davis. I mean, he's consistently running in the 4.4s at Notre Dame during his last few years.
Yeah.
You're talking about those guys, and we haven't even mentioned like Logan Diggs and Audric Estime. I mean, there's a lot of weapons. So you won't be using the whole they just don't have enough speed at Notre Dame. That's not an excuse anymore. It's when Lorenzo Styles is not your fastest receiver, when Avery Davis is not in your top probably 2 or 3 of speed, you've got some wheels.
Yep.
There's no question about it. But guy that intrigues me the most is Dion Colzi.
Mm-hmm.
He's super intriguing to me, Ryan, because it used to be where kind of like he was the normal body type at Notre Dame. Now he's the unicorn on this particular roster just because of some of the weirdness of how recruiting has been. But this is I think this is the kind of receiving core that Chip Long always wanted. And I have come to learn that I think Tommy Rees wants too, where I've got some length on the outside, but it's mixed up with some other speed, where your tight end is your second big guy, not the other way around. That doesn't mean you can't have a big guy as long as he can run. We have those conversations in other shows about the 2023 recruiting class. But Dion Colzi is to me the wild card above all wild cards in this offense, because I'm not expecting him to become the guy this year. I just don't. I mean, he could, and that's why we talked about, like, he could end up having the second most catches if he emerges as the sure start in the boundary, just because of the nature of that position. But I'm really curious to see what he can do, because if he can kind of grow into his game and be a legitimate player, like a 30 to 40 catch guy, he brings some really interesting stuff to the table, Ryan, with that side. I mean, 6'5", 207. He can run well. He's not a burner, but he runs well. You got to start dealing with him now because he steps up this spring. So Braden's got to step up and Lorenzo's got to step up. But the guy that I'm probably most intrigued by as far as who could have the most unique impact for me, it's Dion Colzi. Because if he can break out in that W spot, Ryan, all of a sudden, boy, it gets real interesting with all the other stuff we talked about.
Because it makes the margin for error just so much bigger, right? With that length. I mean, that's the same thing with Michael Mayer. It's like you don't have to have a pinpoint pass. You don't have to have great ball placement all the time with those types of guys. This is the true 50-50. I mean, people say 50-50, but like with those types of guys, it becomes more 70-30 in most situations, right? So and it's awesome that it's kind of taken the shift a little bit, because I feel like for the longest time, there's been a media and there's been a fan side of everything where you're just like, can we get some variety at wide receiver? I mean, we've had towers. Can we get some guys that can make things happen in space? Can we get some burners? Can we get difference? And now there is difference. There absolutely is. And there's different body types. There's different skill sets. But you also have a guy like Dion Colzi who fits that traditional W spot where like, hey, Tyler Buckner, nobody's open, but you got that 6'5" guy over there that can win a jump ball situation, that can win a contested catch. And that's valuable for a young quarterback because you can trust that guy in a tough situation.
Ryan, there's a theory that young quarterbacks need to learn, and that is if a guy like Dion Colzi only has one guy on him, he's open. I don't care what the separation or lack thereof exists, he's open. If it's any kind of vertical route, like if he's running a stop route, a hitch route, and the guy's standing, but you said he's always open, right? I mean, there needs to be some common sense. If he's running a go route, a post route, a dig route, a drag route, a corner route, and there's just one guy on him, throw the ball up to him. You know what I mean? And to your point, I think you made a great point. So I stole your thunder a minute ago. You just stole mine. I think it's a phenomenal point. If teams are focusing on Michael Mayer can't be your security blanket. Your security blanket can't be getting double and triple coverage in zones. You need a security blanket that can kind of be like, hey, I know this guy's going to probably be in a one-on-one and I can throw it up to him. That can be Dion Colzi. If Dion proves himself to be capable of winning those throws, all of a sudden Tyler Buckner knows I got a one-on-one backside. If they bring pressure, I can just throw a back shoulder to Dion and get out of this thing. And he's going to have a chance to make a play where either he catches it or it's out of bounds. That's a great security blanket for a young quarterback to have. And on top of some of the other things, the RPO stuff. But if Dion can emerge and have sort of the role in this offense, kind of like what like a Javon McKinley had in the 2020 offense, where he's going to stretch the field, even though he's not a burner. I mean, it's kind of funny, Javon McKinley, ran like a 4.6 at Notre Dame's pro day. It wasn't impressive, but yet he always made big plays in the pass game. I mean, he averaged 17.1 yards per catch in 2020 because he's a big guy that even when he was covered, he was open. And Ian Book understood that sometimes. And I think Dion can be a similar type of player. Like, look, I don't care if the guy's in his hip pocket. Throw that ball about 10 feet high, throw him an alley-oop. And we talk about basketball and stuff like that, he's your alley-oop guy. He's the guy who's running the fast break and you throw it up. Yeah.
Maurice Stovall, man. That's the guy that comes to mind all the time. Yeah. Brady Quinn, you're in trouble. Let's toss that thing up to Maurice Stovall.
Yeah.
The field.
Right. And he had that huge wingspan and Dion is a very intriguing player. I think the thing I've been told is, and this was the concern we had coming in out of high school, is he was so much, he went to a small private school in Georgia and they weren't playing anybody really. And Dion thought he worked hard because he was working, he was pushing himself, but he was just so dominant that it's like, you don't really know how much better you can be. You don't really know how much harder you need to work. Last year was a growing up experience for him in that regard, where it's like you're going against some dudes in practice and you've got some other dudes around you. You've got to really understand what you're capable of from a work volume standpoint. And what my sources have told me is that's really what this offseason has been about for Dion so far, is like, hey, you're capable of a lot more, but you got to be willing to put a lot more into it. And he understands that now, which is part of the learning experience for a kid coming from the kind of school he went to. And if he can kind of now take that next step and say, hey, coach, throw me the ball. I'm going to catch it. I know how to run. I know how to get open, and have more confidence, because that's the biggest thing Dion was lacking on the field last year. It wasn't route running and all that, because I don't care about that. Like I said, he can get away with not being a great route runner at 6'5" with a huge wingspan. What he can't get away with is not being confident. And at times, Dion did not look confident. And that's going to be the biggest thing for Coach Stuckey to do with him is, I don't care if you don't know the route or not. Whatever you run it with conviction. And then we'll fix it in the film room, or I'll correct you, whatever. But whatever you decide at the snap, make a decision on what you're supposed to run. And whatever you think you're supposed to run it with conviction. Because I guarantee you, Ryan, there have been times you've been watching all 22, or you've talked to a coach or a scout, and they're like, that actually wasn't the route he was supposed to run. Yeah, I know it went for a 50-yard touchdown, but that actually wasn't the route he was supposed to run. But he beat the guy. And I was like, you got to not throw it to him because it wasn't what he's supposed to do. you're still going to throw him the ball. And that's the thing with Dion is, hey, you're supposed to run a whatever slant route, but the quarterback sees you released vertically and you're open and he's going to still throw you the ball. Whatever you do it with conviction. Because if Dion can play with conviction, but he's gonna make plays, whether it's 15 catches, 20 catches, 25, 30 catches. I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's going to be impactful. It's going to be 15 plus yards per catch. It's going to be, oh wow, they got themselves in a tough spot on 3rd and 7, and they went one-on-one with Dion, and he just ran a go route, and they just threw it up, and he outplayed the guy. It's going to be impactful stuff. I don't know if it's going to be a high volume, but it's going to be impactful. And I think that's what I think Dion, if he can play with conviction, I think that's what Dion could bring to this offense this year.
Yeah, I mean, he just brings a different element, like we kind of illustrated a bunch. I think he's the biggest X factor in the wide receiver room because obviously Lorenzo Styles is going to take a jump like we expect, but again, he's just more of a closer, like we've seen a little bit more of what the flashes can be. We don't really know what to expect from Dion Colzi. We know that he's talented. We know that he's 6'5", and in theory, we're talking about the ability to win those contested catches and be a safety blanket. But until it's tangible, it is still just a projection, right? Like he's only caught a couple passes in his career.
Like 4.
So 4 passes in his career. So he is a complete projection. But, I mean, this kid could be one of the leading receivers on the team because the talent, I think, dictates it. And I think he's best fit probably into that W position most naturally. So I think he could take that next step. But he is absolutely, in my opinion, the biggest X factor. If he takes the big step forward, then that's a big sign that it's moving in the right direction at the wide receiver spot.
Right. I think the thing with Dion, too, is it's important for him that other guys step up, and he doesn't have to be that guy. That's the thing. It's like he doesn't have to be a, hey, look, because, again, the W's been the W this year was Kevin Austin. He led the team in receiving yards. The W in 2020 was Javon McKinley. He was their leading receiver in yards and tied for catches with Michael Mayer. In 2019, their W was Chase Claypool. He was their leading catcher. In 2018, the W was Miles Boykin. He was their leading pass catcher. So the W's been that position so far for Notre Dame. I don't think it will be this year. But those other guys got to step up and take some of that pressure off of him. I think that'll help him too. Because if he feels that burden of I got to be this, this thing over here, then I don't know if he's going to be that. And I think the thing that people have to understand too, and I've said this before, Dion is a year younger than most of the kids in his grade at Notre Dame. So he's really should be going kind of into his freshman year from an age standpoint. And the fact that his what would be his 18-year-old year was actually as a freshman at Notre Dame is going to pay dividends for him at some point in time down the road. There's one more sophomore we'll talk about here as we before we kind of get close to wrapping this up, and that is Jaden Thomas. Now he's an interesting guy because we've heard a lot about him going back to December about how he looked great in bowl practices. He's had a great offseason. Jaden's an interesting player, Ryan, because he was banged up his whole senior year. He played with a turf toe his whole senior year. Didn't really have the production that he'd hoped for. Didn't have the breakout that I thought he could have after seeing him as a junior when I liked his film. He wasn't as, in my opinion, didn't have the upside of Dion Colzi and Lorenzo Styles, but he's a good football player. And then the injury he got some bad weight, which can happen to you when you have a foot injury and you can't run. I mean, you can't do a lot of things. And so I thought that kind of hurt him a little bit as a freshman at Notre Dame. He also kind of was healthy at times, not at other times. He wasn't always around. But since he kind of got healthy late in the year, he's stayed healthy from what we've been told. So he finally kind of worked through some of those things. And he's a guy that a lot of people say has had a really good offseason. And, he's a guy that, we compared Dion's role to what Javon McKinley was. And somebody said this in the chat. But in our intel piece that we had, I believe I put this in that offensive intel piece we had a couple weeks ago. The sources that I have compared him to Javon McKinley from a direct comparison standpoint. Similar body type, similar frame, similar catching ability, but a little bit more fluid athletically than Javon was because Javon had really tight hips. And so, you talk about bringing that to the table. And I think the fact that he is more fluid, he can do stuff after that's the thing I loved about Jaden in high school. He could take a short route and make people miss and do something with it. That leads to him. He can play. He has the size at 6'1.5", 215 to play W. And especially if he's similar to Javon. But he also has the athletic skills, in my opinion, to help out at Z and help out at X. I think he can play all three of those. That's also going to add to it. And it's also another reason why Joe Wilkins better have a good offseason, because if you don't, you got a bigger, more athletic version of you coming down the pike in Jaden Thomas. And ideally, you want all of them to step up, right? But Jaden's an intriguing guy because he's going to get a shot this spring. And it's going to be interesting to see what he does with that, and he could be the key to, if he can step up and really produce, all of a sudden that's where your depth, like, okay, now we've got the depth to where we can sustain an injury. If you're Notre Dame, we can sustain, a guy not panning out because you've got Lorenzo and Braden and Avery and Joe and now Dion and Jaden and Tobias showing up. Now that's where you said it about Dion. I think it's true about Jaden. Those two guys really having good off seasons really widens that margin for error from what it is right now, which is really razor thin. And those guys can be really key to that this spring. I think those guys are the two of them you're going to look at and say, okay, one of you has to step up, in my opinion. One of you bigger bodied guys has to step up and help this offseason.
Yeah, I know we're not doing superlatives with it, but I mean, Lorenzo would be my breakout player. My X factor would be Dion Colzi. And then I would give Jaden Thomas I have no idea what you're going to do. Like, I have no idea. You could be just a guy that kind of muddles through a backup role. You could be a guy that ascends and you make everybody look kind of stupid, maybe a little bit. Like, and you could be a true factor in the passing game. Like, I have no idea. I think the outcomes for a guy like a Jaden Thomas are so volatile. I could see him being a contributor. I could see him getting lost in the shuffle. I think there's just an endless amount of possibilities for what he can do, which makes it fun, man. Like, in my opinion, he's the guy that I'm looking forward to most in the spring from a wide receiver perspective, because I honestly, Brian, I don't know what to expect from him. I've heard great things.
We've seen him in zero practices at Notre Dame. We've seen him in zero games at Notre Dame. I mean, that's the thing. If Dion's projection, who had 4 catches last year, you know what I mean? Like, Jaden is that as well. And that's where, again, Ryan, that margin for error comes in, because this is all good and in theory and all, but it never goes where everything you need to happen happens. It never works that way, ever. Somebody's going to get hurt. Somebody's not going to stand. Something's going to happen, right? But the more of these things that go right, the better. But with these last two, especially, there's just not a lot. There's just not a lot that we can really know and feel confident in to say, yeah, this guy's going to be able to do A, B, and C. And Jaden, especially, because we've never seen him do anything in a Notre Dame uniform except stand on the sidelines. Not a practice, not at anything. Yeah. And that's what makes it tough. Now, hopefully you'll get a chance to see him in practice on Saturday.
Right.
And
it makes it fun. It makes it fun, though, because I mean, those are always the fun things, because it's just like you just don't know what to expect, and he could really surprise you. He could not, but like either way, you're going to be on the edge of your seat, because you're interested. You just want to know the unknown, right? Like, you have no idea what to expect with him.
And the last thing is that is interesting, and we'll try to just get to a couple questions here, because I know Ryan's got some packing to do, because he's flying to South Bend tomorrow. So, the tight end battle is going to be interesting, because look, the tight end battle is going to go into the fall, because even if somebody emerges this spring, there's going to be Kane Barong and Holden Stace and Eli Raridan are going to get thrown in that battle down the road as well. But this is a big spring, and I think it's even more important for Kevin Bauman. I think if Mitchell Evans needs another couple months to develop his body and his game, you're going to be a little bit more. You're going to give him a little bit more rope, because he is young. He's just a rising sophomore, because he is still transitioning into a new position, having been a quarterback in high school, and now he's still learning. And the fact that they love his potential, they're going to give him more chances, in my opinion, to make mistakes. If Mitchell Evans outplays Kevin Bauman this spring, Kevin Bauman's going to get buried. There's only one other. I mean, it's Mayer's a starter. There's only one other guy he's competing against, and that's Mitchell Evans. If Kevin Bauman can't step up this spring and hold off Mitchell Evans, then he has no chance to then go into the fall and hold off Barong and Stace and Raridan. He's going to be at best a third tight end. So if he wants to have a chance to really seal that number 2 spot as the older player, this is a huge, huge spring for Kevin Bauman.
Yeah, no, and I'll be rooting for him, man. He's a New Jersey guy, right? So you gotta put
Yeah.
that little rooting interest into him. But I mean, he was a really talented player coming out of high school. I mean, like people forget, like Michael Mayer obviously was the dude, but Kevin Bauman was a very highly
Yeah.
regarded kid as well. It wasn't like he was just like a throw-in end of the recruiting
Right.
cycle type of thing. Like he was a substantial recruit as well. And he's a
Right.
talented kid. He has a good frame. I think he's projectable in the run game. He's projectable in the pass game. His thing has just been injuries, right? Like he just
Mm-hmm.
hasn't been able to get any momentum because he's just been injured a little bit so far in
Mm-hmm.
his career. So this is a make or break it year for Kevin Bauman. This is going to be his potential to play a ton, or it's going to be lost in the shuffle, or maybe he's a transfer candidate.
Yeah.
Like it's going to be either one way or the other. I don't see him just being okay with being a backup type because he's a really talented player who I think has the potential to play on the college level. It's just, unfortunately, with the circumstances he's been thrown into during his career with the injuries, he just hasn't been able to hold a role in the offense. He hasn't been able to
Right.
gain one, unfortunately, for
Right.
him.
Because he's been at a deep, deep depth chart. And that's the challenge. Now, and that's why it's so important that he takes advantage of this opportunity of only having 3 tight ends in the spring and say, hey, look, you're going to get, I mean, reps aren't going to be an issue for Mitchell Evans and Kevin Bauman this spring. They're not. They're going to get plenty of reps. The question is going to be more about what do you do with those reps? And as you mentioned, the funny thing is Kevin Bauman's actually has been a better pass catcher than he has a run blocker so far in his career. That's the thing this spring is he's got to get a lot better in the run blocking part, because if he's not the better run blocker, then they're just going to put one of the bigger bodied guys in there at the other tight end spot. They're just going to put Mitchell Evans in there and let him continue to develop. But he's got to prove himself that, hey, you know what, I'm healthy. I'm now a junior. I've got more weight room strength. I'm going to go out and I'm going to, be that number 2 guy. Because the number 1, number 2, and number 3 responsibilities for the number 2 tight end are to block, and pass catching's 4th. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Now, if you're a really good blocker and a pass catcher, they'll use you more as a pass catcher. And one of the concerns with George Takis, even though I was frustrated by it, is he wasn't consistent catching the football in practice. And from what I've heard, I don't think that's going to be an issue with Mitchell Evans or Kevin Bauman. And so I could actually see the number 2 tight end role maybe even giving us a little bit more production than what we saw from Notre Dame's number 2 tight ends last year. But a big part of that's going to have to be this spring. They're going to have to, because if they don't step up too, not only do they have to worry about losing time to each other, but if they don't have good springs, they're going to lose time to the number 2 running back, the number 3 receiver. I mean, that's the other thing, Ryan, is the number 2 tight end isn't guaranteed a spot on the field. It's that they've played number 2 tight ends in recent years because those guys have brought value to what they're doing, right? And George Takis was a good blocker. He could do what he needed to do as a blocker. Brock Wright blocked. Tommy Trumbull's a great blocker that could also do some other things. So you've got to bring value to be there. And if those guys don't bring value, then they're just going to do more 20 personnel and do more 20, do more 11 personnel. I think those are the things, and maybe even say, hey, look, we got all the speed and our tight ends aren't giving us much. So let's create a 10 package grouping, right? And they may have to do that. I hope they don't get to that point. And the reason you do a 10 package is that's a way to take some of the pressure off Michael Mayer without putting another tight end who you don't trust on the field, right? As you do some stuff where maybe you go 10 personnel or 20 personnel with 3 receivers, 2 backs, and that gives you a chance. You do 5-10 snaps of 20 and 10 personnel. That's 5-10 snaps that you don't have to have Michael Mayer on the field and kind of wear him down. But you're also not putting a guy on the field who maybe you don't trust if a second tight end doesn't emerge. But hopefully the problem that Notre Dame has is uncertainty about what personnel groups to have because they're so confident in all of them. That's where you want to be. We know we can beat you with 12. We know we can beat you with 20. We can beat you with 21. We can beat you with 11. We can beat you with whatever. That's where you want to be. They're not there yet because right now 12 personnel is, to me, the bigger question mark. One of those guys has to emerge in this competition.
You never want to be predictable offensively. Gives you options.
That's right.
Keep giving options.
So let's get to a few of these comments and questions here before we get out of here. Rob O'Mara. So we wrapped up the receiver tight end part, right? So that's step 1 is done, and now we're going to transition into step 2 of our show, which is our Notre Dame Daily Mailbag. So let's kind of get things going there. Before we begin, I did want to bring up something from the world famous Scotty Nitro. Guys, I normally don't do this, but my wife and I are expecting our first child. Congrats on that, by the way. She is 34 weeks in, but the baby girl, Harper's growth is not where it needs to be. Prayers needed and appreciated. And Ryan, I know you've probably had a lot of anxiety in the last couple of years too, because I know you and your wife had your first child just a little over a year ago, correct? And a lot of people chimed in during it saying, hey, look, went through this too. Vince talked about his twin girls were both underdeveloped at a younger age, but now they're among the biggest in their class. So I can't fathom the anxiety you're feeling. I'm sure Ryan can, but what we can do is to, definitely be praying for you. There's no question. And you've got a support system here at Irish Breakdown, and you know that, which is why you came here. So there's a lot of dads that have gone through this. I would encourage you to reach out to them in this forum. There's as you've seen in the chat, a lot of dads have kind of gone through this with their own children, including people saying, hey, my kid's now a senior at Notre Dame, but he or she was really underdeveloped at the same age and that kind of thing. So reach out to that support system to find out, hey, it's going to be okay. Or, hey, here's some things that we did. Here's some things that we had to check. And this is how it went. So that's kind of what this community is here for. It's not just Notre Dame football. It's anything like that. So you are definitely our thoughts and prayers. I love the name, by the way, the world famous Scotty Nitro. And it's a really adorable name, by the way, Harper. I like that.
Yep.
So let's talk some football. Rob O'Mara says, hey, guys, how come Notre Dame commits visit other big schools, but we never hear about players committed to other schools visiting Notre Dame? That's not really accurate, number one. No. And Notre Dame has flipped plenty of players over the years. I think right now they're not focused on guys committed to other schools, Ryan, because a lot of their top prospects are not committed. Right. Like the reason that Notre Dame has their players visiting other schools is Notre Dame has more commitments than just about everybody else not named Texas Tech. Number one. And number two is, there's the ability, the talent of Notre Dame's all their commits is super high. So, who would you want them to go after right now? That's kind of my question. And if you look in the past, Notre Dame's flipped plenty of players. And Ian Book, Brandon Wimbush, those are just two quarterbacks that come to my Alizé Mack. Khalid Kareem flipped him from Dalen Hayes, flipped him from Alabama. The list is pretty long of guys that Notre Dame has flipped from other schools. Philip Riley in the current freshman rising sophomore class. There's some plenty of guys that they flipped. And I don't think that's necessarily accurate. And I think it's in this current class, there's just a lot of the top players in the country haven't committed yet, Ryan.
Sure.
Except for guys that are committed to Notre Dame.
Yeah. I'm like thinking through quarterbacks off the top of my head. Like you have Malachi Nelson and you have Jackson Arnold, right?
Right. But their number one quarterback target's still uncommitted.
Exactly. That was my point, is that, even though there's a couple at the position, it's not your top guy on the board. And I think that's just kind of pretty resonant across the board. And even like Boubacar Traore, who was just committed to Boston College, Notre Dame has been on him and he's going to be visiting and he just decommitted. Like it's, it happens. So I agree. It's
they flipped Junior Tuihalamaka last year from USC.
Exactly.
That was the one, one from last year's class they were able to flip. So it happens. And Holden Stace was committed to Penn State and Notre Dame was able to get involved with him. And sometimes too, when Notre Dame gets on these kids, they'll decommit before they visit Notre Dame, because it's kind of obvious. Right. Like once Holden Stace decommitted from Penn State and started talking about Notre Dame, it's like, okay, you see the writing on the wall. There's no question about that. I love this too from Douglas Road Roundabout. So that's a road kind of by where Vince and I live. So that's obviously a local, but I love that name. What wide receiver on the roster? So this is from the conversation we were having on the message board around. We were talking about the 2023 class. And the question was, what wide receiver on the roster has the highest floor, highest ceiling combo? Because what we did was in the chat was who had the highest ceiling, and we both went with Jaden Greathouse. Who had the highest floor? We had one saying we had Braylon James, and then you had Carnell Tate, and I had Tyler Williams. And then who had the highest combo? And we had the same guy for the highest combo. That was Carnell Tate. He has the highest combination of high floor and high ceiling. Yep. Who on the roster at receiver has the highest floor ceiling combo?
I would say Lorenzo Styles, in my opinion, for the guys that are on the roster. It might be challenged by Tobias Merriweather.
That's what I'm saying. It depends on whether or not you count Tobias on the roster yet. I for the sake of argument, I think let's say Tobias is part of this conversation.
Even if
Yeah.
Tobias is part of the conversation for me, I think I would still, I think I would still say Lorenzo Styles. I mean, like I said, man, I feel like you've already saw glimpses. I think that the ability that he has to win in multiple ways gives you a really high floor. Like I think that you can be a dependable, at least secondary option. But I think that people are going to undersell just because, there's the flashy new toys that like he could be a dude. Like he could be a 1,000-yard receiver this year, I believe. So I think I would defer to Lorenzo because I just think that he can win in every single way on the field.
If we're going to talk about highest ceiling, he's not my pick. Just highest ceiling, he's not my pick. I'd probably either go with Tobias or Dion. I think Tobias and Dion both have higher ceilings. To me, it's the combination of the floor and the ceiling. I can't go away from Lorenzo because I don't know if Tobias can do as a freshman what Lorenzo did as a freshman because he was so advanced. I think the combination of the two, I would go with Lorenzo. Yes. No question. If it's the floor combo, the floor ceiling combo, no question about it. Keegan McLaughlin asks, Brian, for a quarterback, what does having the depth at tight end for Notre Dame has do for you as a player? And what does it do for play callers? Also, do you see any tight end being utilized the way Eifert was split out? Yeah, I think Michael Mayer is going to be that guy. And we started to see it last year, a little bit more and more and more. Not a ton, but a little bit more and more and more. To me, what a second tight end does is, number one, it gives you a lot of options in the run game because you've created an extra gap. And sometimes you can create two extra gaps if you're going to put the two tight ends together. Really, you create two extra gaps if they're both attached, but you can do a lot of different things in regards to creating more gaps in the run game. And the more gaps in the run game that you create with your formation means that's more gaps that the defense has to account for. And so it gives you some opportunities to gain leverage, meaning you can go two tight ends, you can go with a wing, or you can motion a guy. It gives you some opportunities to get another bigger body in the run game. And if you have a second tight end that can also catch the football, and we've talked about this, one thing we wanted to see was, move Michael Mayer outside, and you're almost like an 11 personnel with a bigger receiver out there. I think that's where Notre Dame has to get more creative a little bit in theory and time is, hey, have that second tight end be a guy that can block and do attach, can do all that, but then move them out. And I thought that's where they missed out on some opportunities with Tommy Trumbull in 2020, was using him in those ways. But for a quarterback, it just depends on whether or not you use. I don't think 12 personnel does anything for a quarterback if you're not throwing to the second tight end. And they didn't throw to the second tight end last year, so I don't know what that did for the quarterback, other than actually negatively affect the quarterback because you have one less target that is really going to be a legitimate option for you. So. But I don't think a second tight end helps. I think having depth at tight end where it helps you is if you lose a guy like Michael Mayer, who maybe he gets hurt or something, do you have players who can step up and help you still? And, we saw that last year against Virginia Tech. They didn't catch a lot of balls, but we saw some good snaps from George Takis in that game. And the one time they threw to him, he made a big play. Mitchell Evans stepped up and played a lot of snaps and held his own until he got ejected. Kane Barong, I think, stepped up and played in that game. So I think that's really it just gives you a more. We've talked a lot about margin for error in the show. When you have depth at tight end, it gives you more margin for error at that one position. Where if your guy does get hurt and you're like, well, our offense is screwed because we don't have anybody else that's in the same universe as that guy. I think is where it goes to. But anytime you can have that kind of diversity as a play caller, it makes your run game and your play action game potentially dangerous, in my opinion. And but you need to be able to do it right, Ryan, where you're not then taking away from your drop back game, because you talked a lot about predictability. If you're just a run play action team out of 12 and 13 personnel, then teams are going to be able to have a better ability to defend you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Keegan, like anything, if it gives you more options, and that gives you a higher ability to attack a defense, right? Like, and I don't think it's exclusive to a 12 personnel or 22 personnel or, whatever two tight end set you're looking at. It's just the effect that like you can go to that and it can be successful. And maybe you work off of the play action and you have a second tight end that is capable. Maybe it's a Kane Barong or it's a Mitchell Evans that can stretch the seam and that they're capable pass catchers, and maybe they're implemented in the offense a little more. I think it really is dependent on the situation, but I think the more possibilities you have offensively, and that you are effective at, it gives you just a variety of different opportunities.
We have a super chat from Zach Martin. Thank you, Zach. When Mayer leaves, who do you predict, I know it is early, will step into the number one role next year? Lots of talent and depth.
I mean, I guess the natural guy is if it's projecting the way that we think it might, I guess it's Mitchell Evans, right? If he takes that breakout, I would maybe go with Kane Barong because I think that he has a lot of upside as a pass receiver. But either way, I think that with what is on the roster right now, like I think there's a lot of really good players, but there's going to be some question mark going into 2023. I think kind of departmentalizing their skill sets a little bit and using multiple tight ends is probably the direction to go. I don't know if there's just one guy that I look at and say that's the guy. That's the guy.
I think it's a combination of no one being as good as Mayer and the fact that there's a lot of good players. I mean, it could be Mitchell Evans, it could be Kane Barong, it could be Eli Raridan, it could be Holden Stace. I mean, they've got 4 really talented guys that are going to be on the roster going into the 2023 season. I think that ideally, I'd say that take advantage of that and use all of them. Who'd be the number one guy? I think that also depends on how they want to use the time. Like, take Kane Barong, for example, since you brought him up. Kane Barong has a very unique skill set compared to the rest of the tight ends. And you have to ask yourself, like, if you're going to have him be your number one guy, you've got to change how you use the tight end in that role. And I'd say, I think what I'd rather see is him be part of a heavier 12 personnel package where you utilize him in a lot of different ways. And somebody else is sort of that number one role in regards to how the number one tight end is used in the run game, attached, blocking 9 techniques, things like that. Right. And so I think that's the thing, is it just depends on how they want to use it. And for Kane, he's going to have to be significantly better than those other guys to force them to change the number one tight end role to better fit his skill set, unless he can then develop, because Kane was a really good blocker in high school. Can he get the weight and the strength needed to be that in the next level? I know one thing is for sure, his weight room work this offseason has been upper body weight room work this offseason has been really good. And I think that's where the knee injury may end up not helping him, but like let's say he's taking advantage of the knee injury by saying, okay, I can't run, I can't do this. Okay, but I can do this. I can bench. I can do this. I can do that. And his numbers have been really impressive in the weight room. So I think that's going to help him. But I think at the end of the day, I just feel like all 4 of those guys are going to have a role. And there's just too much talent there to not utilize them. And some weeks it may be Mitchell Evans is the guy that gets the most focus or playing time. Another week it's Kane Barong. Another week it may be Eli Raridan. But I'll tell you what, the tight end conversation next spring is going to be a lot more interesting than this one. Where it's like, okay, it's Mayer, and then what else we're going to talk about? You know what I mean? Like next year, it's like, I don't know who it's going to be. Like, and I think that's going to be fun. And to a degree, some that might emerge during the season. Like you said, Ryan, if Mitchell Evans comes out and catches 20 balls as the number 2 tight end, then it's like, okay, he's going to go into this. You're going to have to beat him out. But if he kind of does what the number 2 tight ends have been doing in recent years, he's not going to, if he wins that job. Same with Kevin Bauman, because we didn't mention him in that conversation of who would be the number 1 tight end next year. We didn't even mention Kevin Bauman. It could be Kevin Bauman. But if he wins that job this year, so it's going to be a battle, and it's going to be a battle of really good players. And what we do know is none of them are going to be Michael Mayer. That's just unfair expectations. But within that role of, who can be the Durham Smythe, who can be the maybe a Cole Kmet. I think it's going to be a little bit easier to be a Cole Kmet than it's going to be to be a Michael Mayer, but it's going to certainly be a battle. MT41, this is a good one. Hypothetical scenario. Both Dante Moore and Malachi Nelson called tomorrow wanting to commit to Notre Dame. You can only take one of them. Which one are you taking? I'll go first, Ryan, because I have been consistent from the first time I broke down the film of the 2023 quarterbacks. Dante Moore, to me, is the best quarterback in this class, regardless of not just for Notre Dame, but the best quarterback in this class. And I'm looking at it strictly from a college football standpoint, because I don't get into projecting high school kids to the NFL. I don't do that. How are they going to be in college? I've always said I felt like Dante Moore's the best quarterback. And this goes back to a year ago when Notre Dame was talking about getting a visit from Arch Manning, when they were recruiting Malachi Nelson, and he was committed to Oklahoma, but was still listening to Notre Dame. I've said all along, the number 1 quarterback in this class, regardless of Notre Dame's board or not, is Dante Moore. And I didn't see anything from their junior seasons that makes me change my mind. And so I'm still going with Dante, but it's close. I think Dante Moore and Malachi Nelson, to me, are the clear 1 and 2. I do think they're the 2 best. But I'd have to think I'd probably still go with Arch number 3. But we haven't got into Eli Holstein. I mean, this is a great quarterback class, but to me, those 2 kids to me are the clear best. And that's another reason I want Dante Moore to pick Notre Dame, because I am so much looking forward to seeing 3-4 years of Dante Moore against Malachi Nelson in Notre Dame versus USC. That'd be a ton of fun. That's my answer. Ryan, What say you?
I mean, so for me, it's incredibly close. I think that there's an interesting conversation. I know we just did the ceiling versus floor and combination type conversation, right, with wide receivers. I think that it's a similar conversation to this one because I think that you can argue that Malachi Nelson might have a higher ceiling if everything is equal and the
Can you just
development
explain
is the
why?
same.
Is it the body type? Like, what is it you see
Yeah,
that
I
that you
think
think could lead to him if they both
he,
pan out?
he's taller. He's a little longer. I think there's more projection to his body. Like he could be a 6'3", 215-pound type of quarterback. I think that athletically they're, pretty similar, but I would say that Malachi is definitely a good athlete. There's no doubt about it. And I think that if both are developed properly from a weight room perspective and just from a mechanical perspective, I think that he may have a stronger arm than Dante Moore as well. So I think the ceiling could be slightly higher with Malachi, but I think that the floor with Dante is substantially higher. So I think that when you combine those two together, I would take Dante, but I would accept either answer because I do think Malachi Nelson is extremely talented.
Yeah, I think Dante's arm. This is something you and I have debated before off the air. I think Dante's arm is stronger than people realize because of how his high school uses him. They
Agreed.
don't let him just turn it loose. Like Malachi throws the deep ball a lot in high school. Dante doesn't, but it's more about the offense. And when he has let it loose, he's got very easy deep ball strength and the ball jumps out of his hand. And that's why I hate 7-on-7. But that's the thing is if you really want to see Dante's ability to read defenses, you actually have to watch 7-on-7 film because he doesn't get past the second read in high school a whole lot. It's not him. It's just how they run the offense. And same thing with throwing the deep ball. I think you have to kind of, in some of the, not, and when I say deep ball, I don't care about throwing it 60 yards. I'm talking about like that 25-yard in cut. That's the kind of thing that you don't see him do in his high school film. And that's the thing I think when you see him at 7-on-7. And I benefited from seeing him in person. And so I could see him throwing into the wind in April, in cold, in Ohio, and the ball's just exploding out on, a 25-yard seam that just gets on the guy in a hurry. Those are the things that I've been able to see. And so, but I can understand why people would say other players are better because number one, Dante's of all the big time quarterbacks, Dante has the smallest body, right? Like that he's the smallest of all the quarterbacks. Weight wise, him and Malachi aren't a lot different, but Malachi looks at least an inch and a half taller than Dante, right? And he's a little longer. And there's better athletes and all that. But I just think the complete package is just, and I've said that for a while. And if he commits somewhere else, I'll still say that. It's not dependent on him coming to Notre Dame. I think it's a whole part of the whole package. I love this question from Thomas Lammers. Thoughts on USC's perfect first practice? Hey, we weren't there, but a source of a source of a source said it was the best college football practice of all time. Obviously referring to Colin Cowherd's really creepy, odd obsession. He's always been obsessed with Lincoln Riley and he's always been obsessed with USC. And now you put them two together and it's weird. It's really, really weird. But that was legitimately something Colin Cowherd said. Ryan sent that to me this morning. And what was it, Ryan? It was the best
first practice I've ever seen
the best practice to ever be on a field or some absurd. I'm actually going to pull it up because it was just so weird and cringy and
hyperbolic.
Like even fanboys are like, dude, that's just a little bit of an odd comment to make. I mean, he's a weird dude, man. I'm going to pull this comment up because it was
all I'll say about it while you're pulling it up is that like sometimes when you like say LOL in a text, you don't actually laugh out loud. I literally did roll my eyes when I saw that tweet. I was just like, dude, what are we talking about right now? This
is what he tweeted. Sources tell me Lincoln Riley's first USC practice was flawless. One observer noted some are calling it the greatest practice ever on a college campus. Now, I kind of thought he was joking, and I was waiting to see like an LOL or something, but there was no follow-up to show that he was kidding or anything like that. So it's just it was a little creepy. So flawless first practice, Ryan. I'm glad they were able to with no pads on and on air. They looked great. That's a typical USC thing. USC looks great when they don't have to hit anybody or get hit by anybody. That's always been true.
They might as well call it a spring, man. And it's only going down from here. It's all good from here.
Hey guys, we got no chance of getting any better than this. Was flawless. We're just going to wait till our first game of the year. 99 problems of BK ain't one. I know this is a lofty comparison, but can Kane Barong be similar to Brock Bowers? They are similar in size, and both are reported to run around 4.5. 40 times would be an intriguing combo with Mayer.
I think stylistically, yes. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't want to compare him to Brock Bowers because that kid's a freak. Like I mean, you saw him for Georgia this year, just absolute insanity the way he was able to just
Mhm.
affect second and third level defenders. Like he's a guy that you just do not want to put in man to man coverage on a linebacker or a safety. Like it's just not going to end well. But I think to the question, I think Kane Braun can be used in a similar way because I think he is a mismatch weapon that can be used in the slot as wing, detached, like all that different type of stuff. But I don't want to compare him directly to Brock Bowers because it's just you're comparing him to a really darn good football player. But I think the style and the role could be similar. Yes.
Yes. It's so unfair because if he was as good as I don't say this, it's not necessarily fair because we had ahead of him, but like it'd be unfair to take a guy that's coming off a knee injury that's going to miss a spring and say he's going to have 40 some catches for 900 yards, right? Like that's unfair. But I do think your stylistic thing is and how you can use him in ways that aren't just lining him up as an attached tight end is spot on. Here's a good one from DJ Wilson. I really like this one. What do you think is the most potent wide receiver lineup that Notre Dame could put on the field for 25 plays per game? I'll tell you what mine is, Ryan. As you kind of think about it, it's Lorenzo Styles at W, Braden Lindsey at X, and Avery Davis in the slot. As far as potent, that may not necessarily be like the best in all, but potent. When I think potent, I think anyone can take a hitch route and turn it into a touchdown. Any of them can stretch the field. Any of them can be a home run. To me, in that regard, it's hard for me not to go with Lorenzo and Avery and Braden. And so you say, well, that's not a lot of size. That's bigger than the 3 Alabama put on the field all year in 2020.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, I was thinking similar. I was definitely thinking about putting Lorenzo into that W because I think it just kind of unlocks possibilities a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I need Braden Lindsey on the field, so I'm gonna say he's the X working to the field. And I mean, tough for me not to put Michael Mayer on the field, right? But again, you're talking about potent, so that would say
Well, he
if
said
Thompson
receiver lineup,
plays,
so that's why
or receiver. I'm
I'm
sorry.
thinking 11 personnel with Mayer. So that's why I went with
That's
those three.
fair.
That's what I'm thinking.
That's fair. All right, that completely
So
changed my way of thinking. Then I would
because
say,
if I wasn't including Michael Mayer, Ryan, then I
yeah.
deserve to no longer have a job covering college football.
Well, no, that makes complete that makes complete sense then because my thought was like, hey, why don't I put into that slot role Michael Mayer or Chris Tyree? Like you know what I
Right.
mean? Like that would be an
Right.
interesting combination. But I will defer to yours then because I want to get as much speed in the field as I possibly
So
can.
let's
So I'll
say we're
say
going
Avery Davis
11
in the slot.
personnel, and you got
Yep.
Tyree at running back, Mayer at tight
Mhm.
end. That would be it, right? That 11 personnel there. Because the other thing
Yeah.
too with that, Ryan, is to your point, is if you are going to go 11 personnel with Mayer, you can put Mayer at W and go trips to the field with Styles, Lindsey, and Davis. There's a lot of things you could do with that, in my opinion. So yes, that would be my 11 personnel. So are we on the same page now? I was not
Yeah.
putting Michael Mayer on the bench.
You were not putting Michael Mayer on the bench. He was on the field.
Like I got to sell my company. Why? I said Michael Mayer is not one of their 3 best receivers. No, yeah, no. I would have to give up. I would have to give up this job. It's like you know. Sometimes you hear people say something, you're like, you shouldn't be doing that professionally. You don't know what you're talking about. Yes, receiver lineup. So that's why I didn't say Michael Mayer. So I like where Ryan's head is at, where it's like you got to be thinking about potency. You got to think about Michael Mayer. But I took it a different direction. But 11 personnel, we're on the same page. We'd have the same lineup. Tommy Gunn says, I like this. Brian and Ryan. That's a really nice way of putting us both in there. How would you rank our offensive playmakers? Number one being if X guy gets his numbers, that's about as close to guarantee as possible that Notre Dame will win, and so on. Well, I mean, I think Michael Mayer has to be
Number one.
your number one, right? Because he says playmakers. He doesn't say like pass game.
Mm-hmm. So
I'd
running
go.
backs are included as well.
Yeah, I'd go Mayer. I'd go Tyree, number 2. I might even flip that actually. I mean, because again, if Chris Tyree goes for like $180 in total yards, Notre Dame's going to be hard to beat. Or insert any running back into that equation. You know what I mean? Like I could see them winning a lot of games with Michael Mayer going 3 for 32 because of how the defense plays, and Notre Dame blowing somebody out. Then Chris Tyree or the running back rushes for 25 yards, and they're going to beat anybody good, right? So just that right there might make me have to say that, you know, I'd have to go with the running back position, whether it's Tyree or Diggs or Estime, and then Mayer 2, Styles 3, Lindsey 4, Avery Davis 5. That's how I would rank them.
Interesting. I would actually, yeah. I mean, so same running backs would have to be included first because there's a higher expectancy.
Because what does the question win? Close to guarantee it's possible Notre Dame will win. I just don't see a scenario in which a running back runs for a ton of yards that Notre Dame doesn't win that game.
Right.
I mean,
and I would expect in like a practical approach, right? Like I expect Chris Tyree to average about 100+ yards, total yards per game, right? Like has to, right? And you're probably not going to expect that of Michael Mayer as a tight end, even though he could still do that, but that's pretty absurd to think about. So Chris Tyree, I would say Mayer. I would then say Styles. Actually, I might flip Mayer and Styles, but that's like the one that I'm thinking about. Like I might flip that because like I could see Michael Mayer doing about the same 800 something yards and Styles is the 1,000-yard receiver. Like I could see that in my mind a little bit. After that is where I go Lindsey, and then I think Colzi and Avery Davis are close for me. Like they're kind of a fight, but I think we have a similar list. I would just say 2 and 3 might be flipped in mine.
I think you could debate that, and I think especially too the argument in your favor would be, if Mayer's numbers are down and Lorenzo goes off, it might be because they're trying to stop Mayer. My counter argument to be is, if Mayer's still getting his, it's happening against a defense trying to stop him, which means it's going to allow everyone else to go off. Now, so he says, if X gets his numbers, he didn't say X is the leading receiver. If X gets his numbers, your offense is going to be hard to stop. And that's why I say it's like, if the running back and Mayer go off in a game, and Mayer, and again, it doesn't have to be 150 yards, but if Mayer has 6 catches for 85 yards and Chris Tyree goes for $120, you're not Notre Dame's. I just don't see a scenario in which they're losing that game, right? And now, and I'm talking, when I say $120, I'm talking rushing, right? Just so we're clear, I'm talking rushing numbers, because Chris Tyree got $120 and Michael Mayer got 7 catches for 76 yards in a bowl game, and they lost, right? So, anytime you have a defensive collapse, you can still lose. But in a normal scenario, if Tyree goes for over 100 and Michael Mayer's like 6 for 80, I think naturally you're then going to see those other guys get production, and Notre Dame's going to be hard to stop. That's just kind of how I look at it. So I think you can make a good argument either way, to that point. And so, but that's the kind of question I like, Ryan, where I don't think there is an easy answer for that one, because you can make the case that Styles should be number 1, in my opinion, because if Styles is stretching the defense and beat teams over top, then that loosens things up for Avery Davis and Michael Mayer, right? I mean, but that goes back to the original point we made, which is the more guys to step up this fall, the better it is for Notre Dame, because it does take away your ability to take a guy out of the game. A good defense can say to Notre Dame, Michael Mayer is not going to beat us. A good defense can completely take Michael Mayer out of the game. The question is how much resources do they have to commit to taking him out of the game, and can you make them pay for that in other positions? That's going to be the key, in my opinion. It's a very, very good question, Tommy Guns. And by the way, Tommy Guns, and we missed this the other day. I did not see his text message till too late. But Tommy, if your wife is listening, happy belated birthday to her. We had a chance to meet her, and Tommy, like me, I don't know if this is appropriate for me to say, but like Ryan, we have all outkicked the coverage when it came to our spousal decisions. So I certainly can say that for me. I'm going to say that for you, Tommy. Ryan can speak for himself, but that's my
argument.
That's my opinion on the matter. So, all right. All right, let me see. John A1, as expected, the wide receivers will be coached better. How far behind will summer fall enrollees be? Will a wide receiver need to be polished already to be ready to compete for a role? I don't think so. I mean, if a guy's as talented as Tobias Merriweather, because there's only one guy showing up this fall, right? That's it. It's Tobias. I think his skill set is unique enough, Ryan, and his God-given ability is good enough to where if he is physically ready, you say, yeah, he may not have all the answers, but you got to figure out a way to get him on the field. The other part is, I also do think Tobias is pretty polished. I've said this before. His releases off the line in high school were better than anybody Notre Dame had last year. Now that says more about the Notre Damers, coaching than it necessarily does about Tobias. But I think Tobias is a very natural feel for the game. That's the thing I'll say is, so I do think it helps. But if a guy is really talented, John, if Golden Tate shows up again, and he can only run 3 routes, you put him on the field and let him run 3 rounds. You know what I mean? But it'd have to be that kind of guy, in my opinion, Ryan. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree because I mean everything that I've seen from Tobias, I thought he was a pretty substantially advanced route runner and technician for his age. So if he is, I mean, but he's a little bit of a slender guy, right? Like 6'2", about $185 or so. So it's more about if he is physically ready to compete. So I think in that sense, John, if he's physically ready, I think that he has the baseline to help this unit potentially this year. But I think it will be a tough battle if everybody takes the extension we're expecting.
Yeah. Let's work through some more of these. How's it going, IB? Going well. It's been a while since I've commented here or posted on the boards because I've been immersed in a career change and working my butt off. Good luck with that, man. Good luck with that. He says, with Blake Fisher being so long, fast, and athletic, is there a chance we use him on a gadget play as a designed receiver?
Tackle eligible? Love it, man. Yeah, I love the creativity. I mean, he's we see it every once in a while. I don't think that that's on the to-do list at the top of the to-do list, right? Like I want to see him master the craft of playing right tackle. But
there you go.
if he's mastered that level and then you want to throw in a wrinkle, I'm okay with it. But right now, I don't think that's on the docket.
In 2023, when he has mastered that more, and you don't have a dude named Michael Mayer on your roster, sure. And if you look at it, those gimmicks are usually like against Navy, and you know what I mean? Like, I don't think you're trotting that out against Ohio State or Clemson in 2023. I don't know if you're necessarily trotting that out against, Georgia, Alabama in the playoff, because it's like you lost a game because you threw it to an offensive lineman who didn't catch it. Yeah, you need to find a new line of work. You know what I mean? Like, I just don't know if I'm doing that. I think it'd be cool to do that in 2023. Just as, kind of like when they gave Lewis Nix the handoff in the blue gold game, let him run it in, let him take the Wildcat snap in the spring game. If you remember that, Ryan, several years ago when they had the number 1 on and they snapped it to him, that was a great moment. One of my favorite Lewis Nix moments. But yeah, I don't. Here's one, Ryan. I'll throw some draft stuff at you. Ryan, with the Chiefs trading Tyreek Hill, which I still think they gave up way too much for that. Who do you think they, meaning the Chiefs, are going to target in the draft? They also just signed Juju Smith-Schuster, right?
Yeah.
Recently, I don't view him as a number 1, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, Tommy, my mind goes, and this is pretty traditionally how it goes, right? Like you trade a really good player, you want to replace that position, right? Because there's a hole. I don't know if Kansas City's going to go that route, though. And this sounds kind of silly because they signed Juju. Apparently, they're going to sign Marquez Valdes-Scantling from Green Bay. And obviously, neither of those guys are close to what a Tyreek Hill brings. But I think that they might just be going stylistically at it a different approach. I don't think drafting a guy in the first round at pick 29 or whatever they got from Miami is the replacement for Tyreek Hill in a vacuum, right? Like, I don't think that makes a ton of sense. But if they were at a wide receiver with the first round pick, I would say that Jamison Williams makes a lot of sense out of Alabama if he's fallen that far, because he has obviously that game-breaking type of speed that you could supplement that with what you lose from Tyreek Hill. Otherwise, I think just adding to that defense, because that's just kind of been the crutch to the team over the last couple of years, man. Like offensively, Patrick Mahomes is always going to give you an opportunity to do great things, and their offensive line was very improved last year. But it's just the fact that the defensive just team in general. So maybe it's a pass rusher at the end of the first round, but if it's a wide receiver, I think Jamison Williams makes a lot of sense to supplement that speed that you just lost with Tyreek out.
Corey Hardy says, Brian and Ryan, which receivers in the 2023 class would Notre Dame need lose for it to be considered a good class and a bad class? I think it is safe to say we know what it would take to be an excellent class. I think, look, you'd have to have what happened last year, which is you just lose everybody, basically, except you sign one guy, you don't meet your needs. I don't care how good that one guy is. You need 3 guys. I think it's you fall short in numbers and you don't have any, you're very low on impact guys. And last year was exactly that. They signed one receiver, who's the best receiver on the board, in my opinion, for their board, but you didn't sign anybody else and you needed multiple players. That you'd have to lose everybody except for like one guy. So let's say they get Braylon James and that's it. That's a bad class. If you have a guy like him in the class, or like Tobias in the class, and you sign 2 or 3 other guys, even if they're just kind of okay players, that's not a bad class. It's just not a good enough class to competing for titles, right? You're still, if you sign, like, let's say the receiving class was like Braylon James, Ronan Hannafin, and like just some plan B guy that's just a nice, okay player, you're still going to beat 8 or 9 teams in your schedule with that group, especially with what you're recruiting at tight end and running back. The key is, are you going to recruit well enough to go beat Ohio State, go beat Alabama, to go beat Clemson consistently, to go beat Georgia? I think that's the question. In order to make that happen, you need 3 of, and this is what Ryan and I were discussing today also in private. Was that on the board or was that a private conversation as well? I can't remember. They kind of bleed together.
I think that was a text.
But it was a you need 3 of this 4. And that is Cardinal Tate, Braylon James, Jaden Greathouse, and Rodney Gallagher. You need 3 of that combination, because even if you don't get Cardinal Tate, who is the number 1 receiver on the board at the moment, right? We all agree, and we can all just agree on that for the purpose of this conversation. People may argue, but just for the sake of this conversation, Cardinal Tate's the highest ranked, and let's assume that means he's the best player. And we both think that he is. I think Ryan, correct? We both have him as the best combination of floor and ceiling. He's the number 1 player on the board. If you don't get him, but you still get Braylon James, Rodney Gallagher, and Jaden Greathouse, you're getting 3 top 100 caliber players at receiver. That's really good. Now you can then say, okay, now Ronan Hannafin, who you're recruiting as more of an athlete, hey, now we're going to definitely bring you in as a receiver because we didn't get that number, right? And instead of being the 5th or a swing guy, you're definitely a receiver. That's a really darn good receiver class, right? Now, to make it to make it to where it would be the best receiver class in the country, I think you need to have Cardinal Tate as part of that conversation, right? I think you need to have 3 of those 4, if not all 4, but 3 of those 4. But Cardinal Tate and Braylon James have to be part of that. Then between Rodney Gallagher and Jaden Greathouse, you pick one of the 2. I purposely answered the question that way, Ryan, because I'm going to put you in an interesting spot. You get Cardinal Tate, you get Braylon James. You can only have one of Rodney Gallagher and Jaden Greathouse. And this is so mean of me to do this because I know you love both of those guys, and that's why I'm doing this. You can only have one of them. Who are you taking and why?
I'm taking Rodney Gallagher because he's just different, right? Like, he gives you a skill set that you don't have out of the other 2 because he's that true slot and that true space player. And I think that for me, I mean, me and Brian actually were having this conversation, which is awesome, Corey, because it's literally fresh on the mind. Like I said, if Notre Dame does not get Cardinal Tate, if we still had a class of Rodney Gallagher in the slots, and you have Braylon James outside, and you have Jaden Greathouse who could play outside and in, I still think that's a really good class. Now, is it elite? Close. It's still really, really good. Yeah. It's still really, really good.
Elite upside for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
In my opinion, you need to have Carnell or Rodney in this class for it to be really good. Like, if you don't get either one of those guys, then it's just a good class, in my opinion. Like, I think it's good. If you still get Braylon James and Jaden Greathouse, who I like a ton, and then you get a 3rd receiver, whoever that might be, I think it still could be a good class. But for it to be considered very good to elites, you need one of Rodney Gallagher or Cardinal Tate. Like, I think you need one of them. If you miss out on both of those, I think that's like one of the worst case scenarios in this class.
So if you get Cardinal Tate as part of that group, you're in the conversation for Cardinal Tate and 2 of the other 3, not Cardinal Tate and 2 guys that aren't on the board that we're talking about, right? Like, we're talking about these are look, I love Rico Flores. He's a good player. We talked about him today. I like Ronan Hannafin. There's a lot of guys. I like Noah Rogers. I mean, there's other good receivers in the class. We don't mention Tyler Williams because we don't think Tyler Williams is in the game for Notre Dame. If you want to talk about talent, I'd throw him into this conversation as well, right? But they're not really in it with him. But if you've got to get 3, you've got to get Tate plus 2 of James, Gallagher, and Greathouse, right? You get 2 of those 3. Now you're in conversation of, do they have the best receiver class in the country? That's the conversation, the zone that we're in, especially if you get Gallagher. But and if you don't get Tate and you get those other 3, you're in conversation of, okay, you're in that top. Where do you fit in the top 5, 4 to 6 kind of range, right, Ryan? If you don't get Tate and Gallagher, now you're saying, okay, you got a top 10 receiver class, but it's like 8, 9, 10, right? And again, when Ryan and I talk about that not being a good class, we're talking about with the goal of winning a championship. Again, that class of no Gallagher and no Tate, you're still winning. You're still 8 teams on your schedule you're beating with those receivers, in my opinion. But that's not the standard anymore, right? The standard isn't do you go 9-3 or 10-2. The standard is what receiving class gives you a chance to win a championship, and that's kind of how we would grade that. Speaking of, John A1 says, would you say both Tyler Williams and Brandon James have higher upsides than Carnell Tate? If so, now that Stuckey is coaching, would that make them higher priorities? Braylon James, excuse me. I don't think it's a given that they have higher ceilings. I personally think that Tyler Williams and Brandon James have higher ceilings, but it's like by that much. But the fact that it's not even close in regards to who has the higher floor, to me, it's Carnell still has to be number one, Ryan. I mean, you have to look at both. It can't just be about upside. It has to be about that combination. And to me, that's still what makes Carnell such an important recruit for Notre Dame.
Yeah. I mean, we talked again about this a little bit earlier as well in just a text thread. And if anybody said that Braylon James has a higher upside than Carnell Tate, I wouldn't argue it, but I still probably would defer slightly to Carnell. I think it's in the conversation.
And that's the discussion we had in our text message today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, before the show. So I think, again, John, it's great timing of the question because we literally had this conversation earlier. Tyler Williams, I've seen Tyler, but it's just I haven't seen him enough to make that call in my opinion.
And I'm higher on him than Ryan is, which is kind of the fun of this kind of conversation, right?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, for me in this conversation of highest priority to like an upside pick, it goes between Braylon James and Carnell out of these three for me. And I would defer to Carnell. I just would. Because I think that you make a great point that you have to consider floor to some degree and upside. Like it's not just upside purely because there has to be something. There has to be a sticking point. There has to be there has to be a kind of an understanding. So I would defer to Carnell, but I wouldn't argue with anybody that has Braylon James as the highest upside in that situation.
I personally think Braylon has the highest upside of all the receivers. I think the difference in upside between him and Carnell Tate is like this, right? And so I say the same thing to Ryan that he said to me. I think it's Braylon. He doesn't, but he's not going to argue with me about it. He thinks it's Carnell. I think it's Braylon. I'm not going to argue with them about it, right? Because I think a case could be made for both, and it's just kind of like some of it's almost like what's your style, what's your personal preference of what you look for in a receiver, right? And I've always said I like bigger guys. That's going to be why Braylon is going to take the nod for me over Carnell. He's taller. He's a little thicker. He's going to be bigger when they all fill out, I think. He's got longer arms. I mean, so that's a personal preference thing. There's going to be other people that I know who I respect who think Rodney Gallagher has the highest ceiling of all of them. I know people that think that. So to me, the thing though is to answer the big part of the question though is I always put more emphasis on upside, Ryan. I always put more emphasis on ceiling, but I don't think it's 90-10. It's like 60-40, right? And so the fact that it's close in upside, because like here's the thing we don't debate. We could debate all day and make our cases for who's got the more upside, Tyler Williams, Braylon James, or Carnell Tate. We could debate that all day long. The conversation of who has the highest floor is as long as it takes you and I both to verbalize the words Carnell Tate.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's how long the debate is. I mean, and then it's the flip side for Jaden Greathouse, because we actually both think Jaden Greathouse has the highest floor, but there's a big difference between his ceiling and Carnell Tate's ceiling. And that's the whole point. There's just as great of a gap between his ceiling and Jaden's, and I would even argue even less than there is between his floor and Braylon and Tyler's floors. I think there's a significant difference. Carnell Tate and Jaden Greathouse show up as freshmen, and they are among your best players, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think Braylon's going to need time. I think Tyler might need time. They're going to play as freshmen, but it's more as like you're bringing in a role of a 10 catch, average 20 yards a catch guy, where Carnell could be in contention for like him as a true freshman. Him and Tobias and Lorenzo are battling for who's your dude. You know what I mean? Or maybe who's your number 2 dude behind Lorenzo.
Sure.
That's whereas Braylon will break out after Lorenzo's gone. Does that make you know what I mean? Like that's kind of how I look at it. So that's why I still think Carnell Tate needs to be priority number 1, because it's that combination of floor and ceiling. And it sounds like Ryan and I are on the same page on that one.
Yep, absolutely.
99 problems, but BK81. I'm going to say that the entire name every single time because I love that name. With the overall lack of depth at receiver, is there any concern, and if so, how much, that one or more of the senior receivers will transfer if they are supplanted by the sophomores on the depth chart? I don't have any concern of that. especially with Avery Davis. He's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you. I think Braden Lindsey wouldn't be a transfer candidate either. Would you think Joe would maybe be if he's passed up, or you think he's just?
But Joe technically has another year left.
True,
and
true.
the thing you have to understand about some of these guys is some of these kids, they love Notre Dame. And like a guy like Joe Wilkins, I think Joe is realistic enough to know that, like, I'm not a future first-round draft pick if I transfer to Georgia Tech. There's a lot of feeling. Notre Dame had an unusual offseason in that they didn't really lose any transfers of guys that they wanted to stay. And they got back almost every guy they wanted to come back, with the exception of Kevin Austin, right? I mean, everybody else that they wanted to come back came back. Foskey, Patterson, all of them. The reason for that is this team, whether they're right or wrong, it's not the discussion I'm having. I'm telling you what they believe. This team believes they can beat anybody. They truly believe that they are a championship team. And I believe, from talking to some conversations, that some of the roadblocks to them winning are now gone. And that's why a lot of them came back. There's a belief in Coach Freeman. There's a belief in the staff that he's put together. And there's a belief, more important, in each other that, hey, if we all, and this, I can promise you, this conversation happened. I'm not making this up. This conversation happened. I've talked to sources. Dude, if we all come back, now Kevin Austin wasn't part of this conversation because Kevin's decision was made before the bowl game, as we talked about. If we all come back, we can win this thing. And just because you're maybe not starting, you're going to have a role. And I think Braden understands that. Joe understands that. Avery understands that. And, I think that's a big piece to it. So I don't think any of them would transfer before this season. Now, could maybe a Joe transfer after the year and take a sixth year somewhere else? Maybe. But I think they'll all be here for this year. Because you're talking about you're talking about some of your better leaders. Joe Wilkins is one of their better returning leaders on offense. Avery Davis is a returning captain. I think if they were going to leave, I think they would have already done so. That's just my 2 cents. But nowadays, I don't put anything. Last 2 questions we're going to get to. Irish, Gordy, and Knott. How important are those posts from guys like Tate and Mpemba where they want people to just interact with their content? How much do you think they're weighing the analytics from those? I don't think they're factoring that stuff at all. I think these kids just they like the attention. Like Carnell Tate had a tweet. What was it? The one on Instagram? Somebody asked him when he's going to commit.
When Dante does.
When Dante does.
Yeah.
And then he deleted it later, and people are showing it to me, and they're like, "What did he let?" One buddy of mine texted me, Carnell let the cat out of the bag. I'm like, y'all, Carnell Tate's way more savvier than you're giving him credit for. He knows how to press the right buttons, right? And these kids have fun with social media. I mean, they're masters of it, really. And so I think they like it to build their channels up. I think it's good for branding. And that's the other thing is these kids are very NIL conscious, whether it's going to be about I'm taking the highest amount now or, hey, look, I'm going to go somewhere and the opportunities that this place is going to present me, I got to build my brand up. Mm-hmm. I think there's all of that. They grew up in a world of social media influencers, right? And it doesn't mean you're committing somewhere. It's just, okay, if I can get this fan base to all follow me this time, and in 2 days, in the middle of Mpemba's visit, there were people talking about how I can't believe he put a picture out of him in a Michigan uniform during his Notre Dame visit. And a day later, he's given away. I just don't think that they look at it from the standpoint that we look at it as fans and analysts of like, oh, gee, what's the hidden meaning behind this? There is no hidden meaning. He's trying to build up his brand. And I'm going to get the Michigan followers on this day and the Notre Dame followers on that day and the Tennessee followers on the next day and the Ohio State followers. That's what it's all about to me, in my opinion. I don't think that stuff factors at all into their decision. I think the only way that fans interactions can impact the kids' recruitment is negatively. When, they attack them or they, like if a bunch of Notre Dame fans jump in on a kid and start being negative towards him because he puts something up or says something or does something, you're done, right? But I don't think it sways a kid positively anywhere. I have yet to see evidence that is the case. There will come a day where some kid will say, I'm going to commit to whatever fan base retweets me the most. That will happen someday. I'm almost can guarantee it. But it's going to be, I think, down the road a bit, in my opinion.
Yeah. My biggest thing with the whole situation is you hit it on the head with one part is the building of the brand. Like these guys, I mean, let's call it what it is, man. Their brand is extremely valuable in this NIL world. It's like the more social media following you have, the more engaging you are, that will sell and that will make you a valuable commodity. So it's all about branding, in my opinion. It's all about playing the game. It's a game, man. And Cardinal knows how to play it, I think.
Yeah, no question about it. He's a master for a junior in high school, because that's what he is still. He's a master at manipulating people on social media. And I say that in a very complimentary fashion. That is not a shot or dig at all. I enjoy it, because it's just kind of fun. Here's the last question. I'm going to save this question for last, Ryan. Chris Ayers says, thoughts on Michael Mayer possibly being the best tight end to ever play at Notre Dame? You want me to take first shot at this, or do you have an immediate reaction you want to give?
I'll give my immediate reaction. Why not? I think it's possible. I do. I know it's going to sound nearsighted because, I didn't see Dave Casper play. I didn't see Irv Smith Sr. I didn't see some of the greats that have come through in an older generation. Mark Bavaro. I didn't see Mark Bavaro when he was drafted by the Giants. I didn't see it. But I will say the best of my lifetime, yes. Because I think that him and Eifert's going to be a conversation, but I mean, Mayer is already to that level, in my opinion. At least from a statistical standpoint, they were right on the same kind of, wavelength as far as what he was as a sophomore comparative to what Eifert was as a junior, if I remember correctly. They were almost identical numbers. And you're only going to think that Mayer can take a step, right? And he can, it's a little bit of projection involved. But if you're asking me if he can be, yeah, I think he can be. I really do. And I think that he can be a top 10 type of talent in the NFL draft. I think that he can be that type of player. I think he's going to be a multi-year All-American. I think he's going to set records. So yeah, I think from a lot of standpoints, he could be. Yeah.
Before I give my answer, I have a follow-up for you, Ryan. You're saying he can be, meaning he's not there yet, but he can be.
Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah.
No, right. I'm clarifying for people. So I'm setting you up for a question. What would he have to do this year to show that? Obviously, high NFL draft pick is part of it because people have, but as far as just their production at Notre Dame, what would he have to do this year in your mind to say, okay, yes, this is the best guy I've ever seen do this at this position in my lifetime?
Well, I would say the production is already to that level. If he does similar production because he can have similar production and still be a much better player than he was this year. He can this past season. It's very possible. But if he's a multi-year All-American and he takes that next step where he's a guy that is the best tight end in college football, but is now unquestioned the best target in college football, efficiency-wise, well, Michael Mayer is going to make that big play. He's that dude at all times. So I think when you kind of just format years together, I think it's very possible. I really do, because I think that he can take that next step and he can be I feel like right now, if it ended, I would say he's neck and neck with a guy like a Tyler Eifert in my era, right? Yeah. But if he does that multiple years now, then it's multi-year All-American, setting himself up to be a high draft pick. It just kind of checks a lot of boxes.
So for me, first of all, it's hard for me to say best ever for anyone because there's so many of these guys I haven't seen. And that's the point that Ryan was making. How can I compare Michael Mayer to Ken McAfee? Who, Dave Casper was a great player. Dave Casper was the better pro, but Ken McAfee was, a lot of people older than me, and Lou Samoji would say the same thing, is the better player in college, right? Ken McAfee was the number 7 overall pick. He was a kid that was a national champ, but also won the Walter Camp Award in the New Rockne Memorial Trophy. He's a 3-time first-team All-American. Michael Mayer never have those kind of accolades. Now, part of that is because tight end usage is different, and I think Michael Mayer's obviously, I think he got screwed out of a little bit this year. It's a 3rd-team All-American. I don't know if there's a tight end in the country I'm taking over Michael Mayer this past year. I'm sorry, there's just not, in my opinion. But whatever the case may be, I think in order for him to do that, because I do think he's in the conversation for it. I can't compare Michael Mayer ever to Ken McAfee because it's just a different world and a different game. Because there's 2 ways to look at it. Michael Mayer will never have the accolades that Ken McAfee had. Ken McAfee will never have the production that Michael Mayer had. Michael Mayer already broke every single season record that Ken McAfee held. Broke every single one. Now, there's 2 things to that. Number 1, the game has changed. Number 2, they play more games now, right? Just Facts. But Michael Mayer this past year as a sophomore set Notre Dame's single season record for a tight end in catches, yards, and receptions or receiving touchdowns. And in some of those, Ryan, it wasn't really close. And so, that's what makes these conversations hard. So then you'd have to go down to, well, you watched them play. Who was the better player? I never saw Ken McAfee play. I couldn't tell you how good he was. But obviously there's a lot of people that played. And this is why I wish Lou Emoji was one of the many reasons I wish Lou Emoji was still with us, because these are the conversations he and I would have, because he has a reference point of Ken McAfee and those type of guys. But when you look at like single season records for a tight end, Tyler Eifert had the record at 803. I mean, so Ken McAfee's best was 797. Michael Mayer kind of smoked Ken McAfee's best. He had 840 this year. I mean, he beat that pretty convincingly. When you look at catches in a season, right? I mean, Michael Mayer broke that record too, I believe. Actually, no, did he? Yeah. So Ken McAfee's best season ever was 54. Tyler Eifert had the record at 63. Michael Mayer caught 71 this year. And then the touchdown record was 6, which Cole Kmet recently tied, and Michael Mayer beat by 1. So I think he'd have to kind of up his production. I think he needs to kind of have like an All-American type of season where he's clearly the best tight end in college football. And I think to a degree, the NFL draft, he needs to be a top 20 draft pick. But also I think Notre Dame needs to have big team success, because here's the thing about Tyler Eifert. Tyler Eifert was the best player on an offense that went and played for a national championship. That's what Tyler Eifert has going in his favor. So statistically is all I can compare Ken McAfee. Statistics, All-American awards, and draft status is all I can use to compare Michael Mayer to Ken McAfee. So it's not really fair to do so. I think Tyler Eifert is probably the best tight end I've seen. Him and Irv Smith and Derek Brown are the three best that I've seen as far as just impact and talent at Notre Dame, with all due respect to Kyle Rudolph, because Kyle Rudolph can never stay healthy. That was the problem with Kyle. He just couldn't stay healthy. And that factors into it. But, Eifert and probably Irv Smith. But the fact is, Irv Smith played at a time where he was the best tight end, but he didn't catch a lot of balls. I mean, I'm looking at catches for a season for a tight end, and I don't see Irv Smith's name on there. Matter of fact, I don't see any of the 1990 tight ends on there. That's just the nature of the offense that they played in. It's Tyler Eifert. Well, it's Michael Mayer, Tyler Eifert, Ken McAfee, Tyler Eifert, John Carlson, Anthony Fasano, Tony Hunter, John Carlson, Ken McAfee, Kyle Rudolph, Troy Nicholas, Mark Bavaro. Now, a couple guys have jumped on there since this year. This was from 2018. Cole Kmet had jumped into that top 10 with the season he had in 2019. But I mean, Michael Mayer had 32 catches, which would have tied for 10th in 2018 as a freshman. So the production isn't close, but I need to see him be more of a game wrecker than he's been. I think he needs to be a better blocker, because that's the one thing that Lou would always say about those guys back then, is they were great blockers. And I think Notre Dame has to have some a little bit more team success. I think that team success has to factor into greatness, in my opinion, when we're talking about an all-time great. For me, it just does. I mean, part of the reason I think Tim Tebow is held in the regard he's held is because he was a winner. Played in 2 championships and all that other kind of stuff. So I think that has to factor in. And why Pat Mahomes was never considered a great college player, despite having absurd college numbers. Right? So for me, do I think Michael Mayer has a chance to be that? Absolutely. But he needs to kind of repeat the numbers, but the impact of those numbers has to be greater. Right. I think that's, Ryan, what we're kind of getting to is, Ryan didn't say he's got to catch 5 more balls. He's got to have 80 more yards, and he's got to get to 10 touchdowns. It was the impact of those numbers, the biggest threat in the game at that position. I think that's what we need to see, where it's clear cut that he's the best tight end. And that's going to be tough next year, Ryan, because there's a lot of good tight ends in college football next season.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think someone put it into the chat. We're talking about Brock Bowers, obviously, right? He's like one of the next guys up. So, I mean, it's not going to be clear in a way that Michael Mayer is the best. I think he is the best tight end in college football, but he has to go about and he has to prove it, right? And I think that we think, and I don't want to speak for Brian, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there's a level up that Michael Mayer can still go. Like, I don't think he's a finished product. I don't think he's hit his ceiling. I think that I don't think it's likely because there's going to be a lot of attention on him, but like I wouldn't be shocked if he had 1,000 yards this season with how talented he is. Like, it's possible. I don't think it's going to practically work, but I still think that he could get a lot better. So
Yeah.
I do truly believe that he could at least be the best in my lifetime. Absolutely.
Ryan, he could be that and have less production than he had last year. I mean, that's the
Exactly.
other flip side of that. I mean, let's not forget that the year that Kyle Eifert won the Mackey Award, and the year that Kyle Eifert was a first-team All-American, he had significantly less production than he did the previous year in 2011 when he wasn't any of those things. I mean, as a senior,
you were just combining Kyle Rudolph and Tyler Eifert.
I'm sorry, Tyler Eifert. Tyler Eifert. Yeah, sorry.
It was funny.
What did I say?
Funny.
Kyle Eifert. Tyler Rudolph.
Eifert.
Tyler Eifert. In 2012, the year that he was an All-American, and I believe he won the Mackey Award in 2012. I believe. Let me look this up just to make sure that my memory is still serving me correctly.
I would hope that he did. I would hope that
he won the Mackey Award in 2012 and was a first-team All-American in 2012. He caught 50 passes for 685 yards and 4 touchdowns. The year before, in 2011, he caught 63 passes for 803 yards and 5 touchdowns. But he wasn't an All-American, didn't win a Mackey Award. Why? They went 8-5. Right? But I would argue that his impact in 2012 was also better because in 2011, he benefited from having Michael Floyd being the guy. And so Tyler was sort of the number 2, and he would win some of those matchups. In 2012, he was the guy, hands down, the guy. Teams game planned for him. They tried to stop him, and they couldn't stop him. Here's the other thing Tyler Eifert had that I think Michael Mayer needs to have. Tyler Eifert had some game-defining moments. You think of the phenomenal touchdown catch he had in Stanford in 2012. He doesn't make that play for a touchdown that, you know what I'm talking about, that in like double coverage, the pass from Everett Golson. He doesn't make that catch. Notre Dame doesn't win that game. They don't go on to play for a championship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Stanford beats him for like a 5th year in a row, all that kind of stuff. He had some game, like, program-defining moments during his career, and I think Michael needs to have those. But to your point, Ryan, his overall play needs to get better, and it can get better. But it doesn't guarantee that he's going to have better stats. And the perfect example is Ohio State. Do you think Jackson Smith-Njigba was Ohio State's best receiver this year?
No, it was Garrett Wilson.
And I don't think it was close. Their production also wasn't close. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, he wasn't anywhere close to Jackson Smith-Njigba's production, and here's the numbers. Jackson Smith-Njigba had 95 catches. Garrett Wilson had 70. And played 2 fewer games, but still had, if you go catches per game, 7.3 for Jackson, 6.4 for Garrett. Total yards, receiving yards, 1,606 for Smith-Njigba, 1,058 for Garrett Wilson, 2 fewer games. So let's look at it this way. Per game, Jackson Smith-Njigba 123.5, Garrett Wilson 96.2. The only area he was better was touchdowns, 12-9. Chris Olave led the team in touchdown receptions. Garrett Wilson led Ohio State in 0 passing reception categories last year. 0. But he was clearly their best player and most impactful player. And I would argue that a lot of the production that Jackson Smith-Njigba had was because teams were so focused on stopping Garrett Wilson.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's the point that I'm making is the production may not necessarily equal what it was this past year. I think they're going to try to get him the ball as much as possible. I mean, it could get better. I'm just saying if he has 68 catches for 820 yards and 9 touchdowns, that may not be the production he had this year in most categories. It'd be more in touchdowns. But then you're going to look at like, oh, Lorenzo Styles had 70 catches for 1,100 yards because he was getting single covered all game. Braden Lindsey had 35 catches for 790 or 800 yards and averaged 20-plus yards a catch because teams are so focused on Michael Mayer. But then Michael Mayer still gets his. That's the sign of a great player. That's a sign of an all-time great player. And it goes beyond stats. So that's what I always say. Stats can be misleading. They can be misleading. You need the proper context. And so if that happens, Ryan, and Michael's game is that way, regardless of what the stats say, then yes, he will go down, in my opinion, as the best tight end Notre Dame has ever had in my lifetime. And that's all I can evaluate. I can't evaluate. Only Mark Bavaro I ever watched was with the Giants. I couldn't tell you what he was at Notre Dame. I never saw Dave Casper play at Notre Dame. I never saw Ken McAfee or Tony Hunter. I was 4 years old when Tony Hunter played his last year at Notre Dame. I can't tell you that. But from like sort of like 1990, like 88 to 90 on, I can evaluate that. Because number one, there's film I can go back and watch if I'm not sure of something. You know what I mean? And so of that period, then yes, Michael Mayer is not number one right now. I would say Tyler Eifert's probably number one still right now for me. I'd say Michael Mayer, after the year he had last year, probably moves up to number two for me. I do think just because Ryan, the production is so much greater. I mean, we could argue all day about how good Irv Smith was and all that kind of stuff, but I mean, I'm going to pull his stats up now. I mean, I don't think people understand how little Notre Dame actually threw to the tight end. Irv Smith had 1 catches in 89, 1 catch in 1990, 6 catches in 1991, and in his last year had 20 catches for 262 yards. Irv Smith never had a season that came anywhere close to what Michael Mayer did as a true freshman. They just never threw to him, and Derek Brown he started as a college freshman at Notre Dame on a team that won a national championship. And his production was very similar. If you look at his numbers, 12 catches, 13 catches, 15 catches, 22 catches, never had more than 325 receiving yards in a season. It just, you just can't compare it production wise. And Tyler Eifert, to me, just was never healthy enough. And honestly, Tyler Eifert, as good as he was, had some big moments. He was never the consistently great player that Michael Mayer was last year, in my opinion. And that's just my 2 cents. So, yeah, that's kind of my stance. But I would love to have this debate with somebody that's like 65, because then you could get a reference point for, okay, I saw Ken McAfee play. Let me tell you about Ken McAfee, right? I saw Dave Casper play. I saw Tony Hunter play, or whoever you want to have in that conversation. And that's one of the reasons I used to love working in the office of Loose Emoji, because I would just ask him those questions and just enjoy it. Well, you have to compare this, and it's just so much fun. So anyway, that's going to be it for today's show, Ryan. I think we got to most of the questions, and definitely some very interesting stuff. I thought that was a great way to end the show. If you're going to talk about tight ends and all that, I think it was a great way to end the show. So thank you so much. We'll be back tonight at 8:00. We're going to talk Rovers tonight. We're going to talk kind of Rover linebackers. We're going to talk about sort of the 4 Rovers that are on the board. That's tonight, 8:00 p.m. Eastern. That's our film session. We're going to break down Samuel Mpemba. We're going to break down Darian Gillette. We're going to break down Jaden Osbury, and we're going to break down Tamir Robinson. So we're going to dive into the film, talk about those guys, how they fit. It's going to be a very, very interesting conversation, no question about it. As Mace AK says, join the message board. And as we say right there below me and below Ryan, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. If you're listening via a podcast platform, give us a 5-star review. And hey, y'all, listen, you guys know about my Built Bar thing. They released, so the bar I kept talking about for the last week or so, it was the brownie batter puff. And I got one as an ambassador pack. They're selling them now. I bought 5 boxes because I know my wife is going to steal at least 2 of the boxes. Okay. So I had to make sure that we had some, and it's a one of those limited supply things. So they're not going to always have them, kind of like cookie dough. So I made sure I have enough for a while. So I bought those. If you use the Irish Breakdown promo code, you get 10% off your entire purchase. So make sure you check that out too. And of course, join us on the boards. We had some of these conversations. Ryan and I had the conversation privately. Then we put that premise on the board for people to dive into. It's been some very interesting conversations. Not everybody agrees with us, and that's part of the fun of this whole thing. So anyway, for Ryan, for Brian, Vince tried to be with us, y'all. He gave it his best effort. He was willing to be on the show, but I said, no, let's go in a different direction. So he was ready to play like a champion today, his best effort. So we just went in a different direction. But Vince will be back tomorrow. He'll have his office back tomorrow, and he'll be with us, and we're going to wrap up our spring previews. So everybody have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining us on the Irish Breakdown podcast.